Can't. Okay, ready? Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Good morning. So good to hear everyone's voice. I'm Cynthia Dean. I'm the CEO of Missouri Boot Hill Regional Consortium, and welcome. We've had this conference workshop for many years, and this is the first time that we've actually had a virtual workshop. So we have a full agenda. I'm going to move right ahead. And we have close to 200 people that have registered for the conference, for the workshop. So we're real excited about that. On behalf of our board of directors, some of them are on the call, our staff, our volunteers, and our partners and our presenters, we want to welcome you to our 22nd annual virtual low birth weight workshop. And we couldn't do this without the support of HRSA in Washington, the Division of Healthy Start and Perinatal Services. We definitely want to acknowledge and thank them. And we have an excellent agenda with a lot of professional speakers, local and national, who's going to share their expertise and experience around various topics. And we have a very special welcome from Senator Roy Blunt out of Washington, D.C. So I'm going to turn it over to Rhonda, our facilitator, who has done a great job because we have a full agenda. And I will get back with you at the end of the workshop. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Dean. Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. We are really excited to have you here today. The first thing I'm going to do is go over a couple housekeeping rules, and then after that, we will move on to Senator Blunt's video. Okay, so as you guys heard, the meeting is being recorded. We are going to email everybody the recording so that they have access to that by September 28th at 5 p.m. We've muted everybody upon entry by default just to limit any disruption. So if you do speak, you will have to unmute yourself. When the presenters are sharing their screen, if you do have any questions or you experience any technical difficulties, if you could write that in the chat box, and we're going to be continuously monitoring that, and we will work on responding to you as soon as possible. Due to time constraints for our Q&A after presentations, we ask, like I said, that you guys put the questions in the chat box, and then we will work on answering those. I will read them to the presenter, and anything that's not answered, we will work on getting to you after the workshop by email. And then so now we are going to watch a video from Senator Blunt. I said we were. Can you hear the video, Ms. Dean? Okay. Can everybody hear the audio on this?
I'm unable to hear the audio.
They can't hear it.
Okay.
Mine does not look like it is playing.
Hi, I'm Senator Roy Blunt.
Can you guys hear it now?
Hi, I'm Senator Roy Blunt. It's great to be able to speak with you today and welcome you to the 22nd annual virtual low birth weight park.
You can't see it. Okay, guys, we should for sure be good now.
I am Senator Roy Blunt. It's great to be able to speak with you today and welcome you to the 22nd annual virtual low birth weight partnership workshop. I've been fortunate over the years to work with Cynthia Dean and the Missouri Boot Hill Regional Consortium, who really have been strong advocates on these issues. As you know, September is National Infant Mortality Awareness Month. This event's incredibly important to bringing together our community and medical providers to help infants and their caregivers throughout Missouri understand this issue. Thank you for all of the organizations that you've worked to put together, the speakers, the participants for your work and dedication to making a difference in the health of infants throughout the state of Missouri.
Okay, so we are going to move on to our next presenter, and that is going to be Deborah Frazier. And so she is going to get her screen ready to share, and then we are going to hear what she has to say. Okay. Deborah, you'll have to re-unmute yourself. I just muted everybody because I was hearing some background sound.
All right, so I think that I am successfully unmuted. Can you also see my screen?
No, ma'am, we cannot see the screen yet.
Well, that is a problem because I do believe I hit share screen. So
Okay. If you want to try one more time, and if you can't get it, we can go ahead and share it on our end.
okay, let me try that and see what happens.
You want me to go ahead and share it on our end?
I'm
pulling it up.
I'm looking for the
Okay.
I do not see the
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share it so that you can get started.
okay, let's do that. And just in the interest of time, let's do that. If you can put it in presenter mode. Thank you very much. And
You're
thank
very
you,
welcome.
to the Missouri Boot Hill Regional Consortium and to Cynthia, who is visionary in her leadership and has grown the Missouri Regional Consortium and this project from its inception. And to all of you, congratulations. This is the 22nd annual Low Birth Weight Partnership Conference. And kudos to you guys. It's not easy to do anything in a rural community. So kudos to all of you in this partnership that the consortium has created. Next slide, please. So Cynthia's asked me to talk about the history of the Healthy Start program and the role of the association in supporting the Healthy Start program and the implications for low birth weight and infant mortality, low birth weight, and maternal health outcomes. Next slide. And so in talking about in the Healthy Start program, we need to go back a little bit in history and look at the groundwork for what this country was going through to create the Healthy Start program. So some of the youngsters on this phone call and this webinar may not have been around, or you may have been toddling around someplace in the late 90s and late 80s and early 90s during this time. But the infant mortality rate in the country was 8.9, and then for African Americans at that time, still we had this disparity with the Black rate being more than twice the white rate. And while that was a national rate, there were pockets in this country that were much, much, much higher. Cynthia knows this. I was working directly south of where you are in the Boot Hill in Arkansas, and I know we had rates that were in the 20s, and that was also the rate in many of the large urban areas in the country. But just as troubling, if you look at these other stats, we had about a quarter of the women in this country who were WIC eligible and not getting WIC services, and women who smoked during pregnancy or used substances that directly affected birth outcomes. And we had a very large number of not just infant mortality incidences, but also low birth weight during that time. The thing that we have to put into context also was that during that time, this was before we had, and it speaks to the importance of the policies we have now, because we learned from that, and a good bit of what we learned came from the Healthy Start programs in terms of Medicaid, the need for Medicaid expansion. And also at that time, we didn't have smoking cessation programs. We were not educating women about the impact or the connection between smoking and the connection between substance abuse and pregnancy outcomes. So that was the situation in the data for that period of time. Next slide, please. So during that time, the U.S. was doing very, very poorly in infant mortality. And it was doing so poorly that we were doing worse than many of the other so-called third world countries in the world. And so the U.S. media picked up on it. It's much like what we're talking about right now for maternal mortality. That's what the infant mortality crisis was at that time. And so there was a huge outcry. Why is this happening in the United States, the supposedly richest country in the world? Next slide. And so they created this outcry. What are we going to do to improve birth outcomes in this country? And at the same time, President Bush, Senior President Bush, as I refer to him, so to distinguish the two, had run for president on a platform to invest in the children of his country. So this came right back to the White House. Okay, you ran on this platform to invest in children, and this is what's happened to children across the country. And so he convened this White House task force, and under the leadership of Dr. Lewis Sullivan, who was our Secretary of Health. And every cabinet in the White House, every office was at that table with other subject matter experts, and they produced this huge report that looked at why this country had high low birth weight and high infant mortality rates. And they found that the major cause, 60% of infant deaths in the first 4 weeks of life, were due to prematurity and low birth weight. And that just about a quarter of those deaths were to poor families and families that were living in poverty. And so from those statistics and other data that was in that White House report pointed to community factors associated with infant mortality and low birth weight in communities. Next slide. So as a result of the findings of the White House task force, there was a call for investments to address those issues. And as a result of those recommendations, there was a huge investment in the public health service workforce, in community health centers across the country, and then an idea to invest in a comprehensive community program to reduce the number of infant deaths across the country. Next slide. And to do so with a sense of urgency. If we save but one life, we save the entire country. And so that was the birth of the Federal Healthy Start Initiative. And it was a revolutionary approach. Next slide. Because it was community-based, and that was revolutionary for that time. It was community-based because the epidemiology of infant mortality in that White House report pointed to patterns associated with community factors, not clinical factors. And that in and of itself was really, really important. And that's what led to, okay, we've got to invest in the community, and we've got to get community at the table to tell us how to design these programs. And so in that first, what we call now NOFOs for the Healthy Start program, it said that those community residents, those with the greatest stake in losing their babies, the greatest stake in the outcomes, must be involved in planning and decisions for the Healthy Start. And so with that was born the Healthy Start Consortium, the blueprint for exactly what you're doing with the regional consortium in the Boot Hill. That is the blueprint for the work that you guys are doing, and doing so well in the Missouri Boot Hill. And the principles behind Healthy Start in that NOFO was that they were to do things that were innovative, not already being done, but to do it in a way that built on the platform of what was working well, and to integrate with those things, and to also do community education that helped build personal responsibility at the local level. That meant that where we had issues around substance abuse and tobacco use and those kind of behaviors, that we did community education, individual education with our clients that helped to build personal responsibility, and that we did monitoring and evaluation. Those early Healthy Starts each had 2 sets of evaluations, an internal QI and evaluation and an external evaluation that compared the work of Healthy Start with everything else going on in the community. And those evaluations, and this is important, whenever we do data, the data doesn't belong to us. That data is a story of someone's life and what's going on in that life of that person. It tells the story of that person and the people in that community. So that data, that evaluation, was always reported back to the consortium in that community to help them understand this data represents the babies who died in your community. Help us figure out how to change that data. And each Healthy Start was also mandated to have an infant mortality review team and a report to help us monitor what was going on. Next slide, please. And along the same lines, we also had both a national and a local communication strategy, so that we communicated with individuals, but also communicated with the larger community. So the larger community was now beginning to understand, oh, wow, it's important that women don't smoke, don't use substance, and and that we as a community need to invest in healthy pregnancies. And why is that important? We had strategies for businesses in the community, because when birth outcomes are not good, it impacts insurance rates, it impacts businesses, it impacts women who leave the workforce and can't come back, it impacts the entire family. And so we had all kinds of communications, both at the national level and the local level. You could not go in the Healthy Start community and not see information about infant mortality, or about Healthy Start, or about interventions that were not up in the beauty shop or barber shop. And at that time, I don't see a lot of them anymore, but in laundromats, or on at bus stops, or any place in the community. So these were all ways that we reached out to and worked with communities, and also got them to help in the design and the messaging of these communication strategies. And we also had strategies to reach out and work with fathers and men in those communities in the early 90s. Next slide, please. So these were the first Healthy Starts that were funded, and I'm putting this here to demonstrate that although the national rate may have been 8.9 and the Black infant mortality rates at that time were twice as high, these rates in these cities that were first funded were extremely high. And they had a mandate to, in those first 5 years, to reduce it by half. And this was a presidential initiative, and the funding of these grantees was followed by a White House, an invitation to the White House to meet President Bush in the Rose Garden. Thank you. Next slide, please. So following this initiative, Mathematica was hired to evaluate the Healthy Start program by 1997 because their first funding cycle was over. And what they found was that these Healthy Starts, and you just got a glimpse of that first round of funding, but they were largely urban communities with the exception of the one rural community and then the tribal community. And that tribal community, and I went through those slides pretty quickly, but the tribal community actually covered about 3 states. So it was both rural and tribal. And the rural one at that time was in South Carolina. But what Mathematica found was that these communities differed greatly in cultural practices, in their geography, and in their politics. But they had everything else in common in terms of the high poverty, poor housing, homelessness, and a number of health issues that had never been addressed in those communities, including high rates of HIV, because HIV at that time was not being addressed in poor communities. That funding was being diverted elsewhere. So infant mortality was a constellation of social problems as well as health problems. Next slide. So Healthy Start money and time and resources were really being spent on trying to build an infrastructure for what we currently call social determinants of health. One of the things Healthy Start was known for then and is still known for is hiring from the community and investing in the community and helping to build the economic infrastructure of the communities that are poor and the communities that serve the residents that we work with. And also, as I just said, interventions that were tied less to clinical approaches and more to other interventions that impact infant outcomes. Next slide. PolicyLink, that many of you may be aware of, PolicyLink also did a follow-up study on Healthy Start. And they found that Healthy Start did a number of things. And one of the most important things that they found Healthy Start did then, and I think we still do, and it's important that we remember one of the roles that we have, and that is to link the issues of infant health outcomes, maternal health outcomes, to the other pressing community issues. And that's the work that consortiums or CANs do in the Healthy Start program. And at that time, Healthy Start helped address the issues of race, class, and culture and perceptions of power and money. And so when the community comes to a table, they can help explain to providers exactly what issues of power and class do to the delivery of services. And to give you an example, there were times that some of you may not know or may not remember when, and that was before Medicaid expansion, poor women were generally, and I called it sort of a herd approach to appointments, were given either morning appointments or afternoon appointments in clinics. And so if you had an 8 o'clock appointment, you went to the hospital, and I'll use Hopkins as an example because in the book on lessons learned, that was one of the lessons that Hopkins learned. And they learned it from the Baltimore Healthy Start clients. They said, you ask us to come here for an appointment at 8 o'clock or 2 o'clock for the afternoon, and we sit in these metal chairs and we wait at your convenience for you to see us. And we may have to, nobody asks us if we have transportation, if we need childcare. And if you're pregnant, you do not want to sit on a hard, cold metal chair for hours. And at some point, something has to give. And then you wonder why we don't show up for appointments. So the Healthy Start program gave providers an opportunity to hear from clients about the best way to serve women and to work with women across the provider and clinician divide, the clinical and community divide, to help women to get into services and to serve them better. Next slide. So this is what Healthy Start looked like and the way Healthy Start has grown over the years. We were funded in 1991, as I said, for those initial 15. And then the March of Dimes put in money in 1992 for 7 new grantees. In 98, we entered what we call the mentoring phase, where the initial grantees, and those initial grantees, by the way, were called demonstration grants. They were allowed to do and deliver services based on whatever the community wanted to do, so we could shake out and see what actually worked. So what we're doing now in Healthy Start is a result of those demonstration projects figuring out what actually worked best, which is outreach, care coordination or case management, of fatherhood services, some of those things. So in 1998, those 22 mentored the additional 55 grantees that were funded in 1998. And then in 2000, we did our replication phase, and then grew to 104 sites by 2010. And then in 2013, we grew to, we actually went to 100 sites with Healthy Start 3.0. And now we have 101 sites across the country. Next slide, please. So over the years, Healthy Start has grown. And one of the ways Healthy Start has grown is through the National Healthy Start Association. As Healthy Start transitioned in 1997, 98 to grow, with the advice and the help of HRSA, the demonstration projects were beginning to show value in communities, and there was no guaranteed funding to continue the Healthy Start programs. And those 22 programs and then subsequent programs wanted to ensure that the Healthy Start program remained around for a long time, and HRSA quite agreed. So the first Healthy Start projects got together, developed a 501c3 that became the association, and then began the work on the Hill to get support and language to authorize Healthy Start and to create the appropriations that now funds the Healthy Start program. And then we've also worked over the years to get it, because nothing is forever, to get it first authorized in 2000. That was our first order of business. And then over the years to get it reauthorized. Next slide. So we've been able to continue the work that was originally started in 1991. And then we work to continue our work with consumers and communities across the country and in partnership with our grantees in Healthy Start. Next slide. And one of the things we do is to also work with our grantees and with our Healthy Start consumers to prepare them to go to the Hill and to tell their stories about the work, the good work that all of you do in the Healthy Start programs and in communities, to work with them and to work with their families in the Healthy Start program. And then we also have a cadre of national partners with whom we work to improve birth outcomes, because we certainly can't do it alone. Next slide. And we learn lessons from our partners and from our Healthy Start clients as well. One of the things we learned from our first Healthy Starts is that fathers make a difference in the lives of their children. So many of the first Healthy Starts in that demonstration project learned early on that fathers make a difference, and many of the Healthy Starts then had fatherhood programs, and many of them ironically also had early childhood programs. And some of those went away for lack of funding, and other Healthy Starts created partnerships with early childhood programs or Head Start programs for the families that they serve. So there was a warm handoff for the moms and the families in Healthy Start. Next slide. So building on the work that we've done with fathers. Next slide, please.
Deborah, did you ask me to switch the slide and I didn't hear you?
Yes, I talk fast. So building on the work that that we do as fathers, we began to formalize that work a few years ago, and we created the Where Dads Matter initiative, where we give formal technical assistance to our grantees, and have encouraged the grantees to hire fatherhood coordinators, and we developed a core adaptive model for fatherhood and fatherhood training. And we also began 5-6 years ago, I'm losing track, a national summit to for fatherhood, and I added the health and wellness of boys and men, because we can't talk about fathers and fatherhood without making sure that our dads have a message about taking care of their own health. Because all too often, men just don't go out there and go to the doctor the way they should. And as they tell us, which is true, a lot of the health programs are built around women, but not men. And Medicaid expansion often leaves them out. And so we work with men around opportunities to get them into the doctor or the dentist, and to mental health services as well. So we fully support male involvement in fatherhood in the Healthy Start program, and we've worked very hard with the division, and at this point, all of the Healthy Start programs follow a minimum of 100 fathers in the Healthy Start programs. Next slide. We also have the Healthy Start Association developed a Texting for Dads program, and in the texting program, we worked with two of our partners, and one of them is Armin out of California, and with Men's Health Network, and we developed this texting program that sends dad short weekly messages about what's going on with the baby in utero, to sort of keep him in touch with, this is what's going on with your baby this month in utero. And then interspersed in those messages are health messages for the dad, basically saying, you're important, you're going to be daddy. Have you thought about your annual checkup? Have you had your blood pressure checked? Have you exercised? So this is about 2 years worth of messaging that's on the texting program for dads. Next slide. So about 4 years ago, and I think we all know now, there's a lot of conversation around maternal health and maternal morbidity and mortality. And about 4 years ago, the association we have an annual conference, and about 4 years ago, we focused that conference on maternal health and maternal morbidity and mortality. And this slide is an illustration of 1987 to 2014 pregnancy-related mortality. And if so nationally we have 700 women who die in pregnancy-related complications every year. And that may not seem like a lot, but it's devastating if it's nevertheless. And I think we all hear stories about women to whom this happens. And if it happens once, it's too many times. But more startling is that third slide about the 50,000 women who have life-threatening complications from labor and delivery. We can make a difference there, guys. And we can't talk about low birth weight of pregnancy or infant mortality without talking about life-threatening complications of labor and delivery. But I think, just as I talked about those early stories about infant mortality, and how the U.S. was doing worse than other countries. Same thing here. There's been a global decrease of 34%, but the U.S. doubled between 1990 and 2008. So we really have to get on the ball and do something about this. The next slide, please. And I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly, but this is, and you guys will get a copy of this. So I'm not really going to dwell on this, except to say that Black women are dying at 3 times the rate of white women. And if that's the population that you serve, or not, we need to address it and do something about it. Next slide. And so that's one of the things I mentioned. The Healthy Start programs are now all mandated to hire a clinician on staff to specifically address women's health and to address maternal morbidity and mortality. And this slide is an illustration of where and how maternal morbidity and mortality and pregnancy-related deaths can be prevented. And if we can prevent 3 in 5 pregnancy-related deaths, I think in every community we need to step up and look at the data and see how we can make that happen. And every state has a PQC and a maternal mortality review team, and I would urge you to be involved with that and to see where you can make a difference in the Boot Hill, and certainly look at what we can do postpartum with 1 in 3 of those deaths occurring anywhere between a week to a year after the birth of the baby. Next slide, please. So we were fortunate in the National Healthy Start Association to be awarded a cooperative agreement. I know that you guys in the Boot Hill were awarded the Rural Moms Grant, and at the same time, well, actually a few months later, we were awarded the cooperative agreement to work on non-hospital maternal safety bundles, and to do that with outpatient clinical settings across the U.S. and in community-based organizations that experience high rates of maternal morbidity and mortality. Next slide. And we're doing that under the framework of equity for the very reason that was illustrated on the previous slides, because of the huge disparity in maternal outcomes and pregnancy-related deaths. So we're toward the end of our first year and looking forward to our second year, and we're going to be working with outpatient providers in St. Louis, in Missouri, and implementing postpartum bundles with providers in the St. Louis area. And as soon as we can pilot that and get the bugs out in the postpartum bundle, we'll be implementing additional bundles toward the end of year 2 as we develop those bundles, and hopefully we'll be able to roll them out from St. Louis to other providers in Missouri, across the country, but certainly looking at a link between St. Louis and other postpartum providers in Missouri as well, and certainly hopefully in the Boot Hill area. Next slide. So as I wind up talking about Healthy Start and the Healthy Start Initiative, we're over 30 years old, almost 30 years old, and we've done incredible work. But I want to move to, next slide, please. So Healthy Start has done a lot of work. But the real work happens at the community level. And Healthy Start is really, so this is the Boot Hill Consortium. Healthy Start, the association, is really, for lack of a better term, a consortium of 101 different communities. And communities are really where things really, really, really have to happen. It's where the rubber meets the road to make anything happen. And I don't want you to think because you are in the Boot Hill or because you're one community, or any one of you to think because you're one voice or 2 voices or 3 voices that you can't make a difference. And so the story I'm about to tell quickly is going to illustrate that, but it's also going to illustrate that we can't ever take our eye off what we know is important to the people that we serve. So how a few good women got the ear of the president, and he was about in his last term when he finally understood what was going on, but he did not hesitate to act. He listened and he acted, thank God. Next slide, please. So these women bugged and bugged and bugged President Roosevelt about the early part of the century. Babies are dying, babies are dying, babies are dying. It was sort of like, you know, Chicken Little, the sky's falling, but in fact, it was real. Babies were dying. And he finally got it. He's like, oh my God, we're spending all this money to figure out how we can have good hogs and good cattle, and we haven't invested anything in figuring out why babies are dying. And he was a bit embarrassed about it. And so he finally said, okay, let's put some money here. And he helped them work through creating what was then called the National Children's Bureau. And that honestly happened because a couple of women pestered the president. They bypassed everybody else and went to the president. It was probably a little bit easier then. But next slide, please. So as he said, it's not a long step or a lot of logic. So this Children's Bureau was organized then with this handful of women, and she hired a few folks with the money she got for this Children's Bureau. At that time, America had no idea why babies were dying, where they were dying, but that they were dying. And so with that first of a kind study, they were able to look at why babies were dying, but also what they could do to fix it. And so they came up with some information. Breastfed babies did better than bottle-fed babies, and that if sanitary conditions were poor, babies died, and that the death rates of babies went down when the father's income went up. Well, women weren't working then. So what that tells you is that the poorer people were, the more likely there was a chance that the babies were going to die. But they also found out that community action can remedy many conditions dangerous to infants. Well, come on. Isn't that the work that you guys are doing? Communities are important, and your voices are important. And we can all make a difference in improving the lives of children and mothers. Next slide, please. They also found out that you could not protect the life of a child without protecting the mother. We can't work on low birth rate and infant mortality without looking at preconception and interconception. That's what it translates to today. So we've got to look at, we can't be siloed and say, oh, I'm only working on this, I'm working on that. We've got to look at the entire picture. And so they also looked at the fact that there were a lot of maternal deaths at that time as well. And they also, get this, they created legislation for the control of midwives and recommendations because midwives were not controlled. There were some probably unsanitary conditions going on then with midwives. So they created legislation that controlled how midwives operated then because that's how babies were being delivered. And they also looked at the extent and cost of maternity care. And they provided education to mothers because when moms know better, they do better. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? And so I thought this was cool, so I threw it in. So they created this thermometer. And so if you can see, the thermometer shows that when a father's income goes up, infant mortality goes down. And it was called the baby thermometer. So I just thought it was cool, so I threw it in. Next slide, please. So some of this stuff we've been knowing for a long time. But just to put it in context, infant mortality is not exactly a clinical problem. It is the constellation of lots of social problems. I lost my slide. And communities can make a difference. Including fathers can make a difference. Working on issues like breastfeeding can make a difference. So let's make a list of all the things that make a difference and do them. Can we have the next slide, please? I want to wrap this up. And as the Children's Bureau said, community action can remedy many conditions dangerous to infants. And as the White House report said, if we save but one life, we save the world. And we have to all remember we can't change what we're willing to tolerate. If we want to tolerate low birth weight, high infant mortality, and maternal mortality rates, we're not going to ever change it. But when we, in our individual and collective voices, are willing to make a change, we can make that happen. Next slide. I thought this was interesting from the director of the Children's Bureau at the turn of the century. She defined democracy when looking at infant and maternal health. And I just found the way she framed it really interesting. And I think all of us, particularly in a divisive world, need to find places where we can find common ground. And making sure that babies and mamas live and they're healthy is a good place for common ground. Next slide, please. So thank all of you for the work that you do, and thank you for allowing me to share the morning with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Caruso, I stopped the screen share on my end, so you should be able to get your PowerPoint pulled up. Thank you so much, Deborah. That was a very good presentation. I know I learned a lot. We will be sending out the presentation. I've not noticed any questions at the moment. If you guys do think of any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we can make sure to see what we can do to get those answered. Thank you so much, Deborah.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, his screen share is working. Yay! And I'm still not muted. Whoops.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
And I can see your presentation. It's not in presenter mode yet, but I can see your screen.
Okay. How is that?
That looks good.
Okay. Did you need to take it? Did Ms. Fraser need to take any questions first? Or did
We
you want
don't
me to?
have any at the moment, so I'm just going to keep an eye on it and let's see.
Okay.
Nope, I think we're good. You're ready to start. So our next speaker is Dr. Caruso, and he is going to talk to us about the impact of low birth weight babies.
Well, I want to start by thanking Ms. Fraser for a very interesting presentation. I did not know a lot of that history of the Healthy Start initiative and what it is doing currently, especially with promoting strong father presence in their children's lives, which is, I think, critically important, and also maternal mortality, which MRBC had a very interesting conference, I believe either a year or two ago on that, which to me was also very eye-opening. I think it's impossible to count the number of lives that programs like Healthy Start and the Missouri Boot Heel Regional Consortium have helped to save or at least make a positive impact in. So I'm going to talk about the impact that low birth weight babies have on our society. Please ask any questions along the way. Um, this is going to be a little bit of a difficult presentation. Once again, I appreciate the Missouri Regional Boot Heel Consortium from opening my eyes and bringing me into the future, because I've not done a Zoom presentation. I normally like to walk around the room and I have to sit, so this may be a little hard. But I want you to start, and maybe throughout this presentation, think about these two births. And so this is the birthday for both of these babies. One of these babies is born extremely premature, low birth weight, separated from his mother, sitting in an isolette, in essence, by himself, intubated. I don't know if you could see when I use my cursor, but there's a tube going through the mouth into the lungs in order to help the baby breathe. There's a tube going through the nose in order to keep air out of the stomach. There are likely lines in this baby's umbilical cord. And all of these interventions, which are necessary to save this baby's life, are having negative impacts on the baby's physical and long-term social health. While this other baby is laying in the room with the mother, receiving all of that bonding and intention and nurturing that is really critically important for us as newborns. And so think of these two lives as we go through this presentation. I'm going to talk about the impact that low birth weights have on our society, mainly stressing the physical, social, financial, and then I'm going to end up with speaking about you and the impact that you can have on the situation. Here's a picture of Iris. She's my youngest child. This is her as an infant. She's now 6. Iris is the 4th baby that we've adopted from the same mother, a mom who loves her children very much, but struggles with addiction. And when we found out, we had already adopted 3 of her other children, and when we found out she was pregnant, we weren't sure if we wanted to go down the road again. And my wife had a long conversation with Iris's birth mother and explained that she could be having babies for the next 20 years and we couldn't be adding more and more babies to our home. But more critically important, she wanted the mom to stay clean. And even though this mom has not been able to stay clean for herself, she got herself into a treatment program and stayed clean throughout this pregnancy. She delivered Iris as a healthy, appropriate birth weight, full-term baby, as opposed to the 2 previous children that she had delivered 12 weeks early and very low birth weight. So it just shows me this mother is a hero in a way, that she was able to do this for this child, to give this baby a good chance. And it shows to me also the importance that community intervention and individual support can help for this mom, because this mother really didn't have that support in her life. But it was provided through our family, but also through a number of different community organizations to help her. So as we get started, I want to just go over a few definitions so that we're all kind of talking about the same thing. Mainly, prematurity is any baby that's born less than 37 completed weeks, or 259 days from the start of the last menstrual period. And while it might seem odd that we count it from the start of the last menstrual period, that's a date that could be fairly well remembered and fairly well set. And so that's why we use that as our benchmark, as opposed to trying to determine the exact day of conception, which some mothers may remember, but many may not. The other thing is, so that's what prematurity is. Then prematurity and low birth weight are often used interchanged, but they're not the same thing. A low birth weight baby is any baby born less than 2,500 grams, which is about 5 pounds, maybe 5 pounds, 3 ounces. either way, you can be a full-term baby and still be low birth weight, or you could be a premature baby, but if you weigh 7 pounds, you're going to be considered, not low birth weight, even though you're premature. Very low birth weight are babies that are born less than 1,500 grams, and extremely low birth weight are those babies that are less than 1,000 grams. So going back to the impact that these babies have, I'm going to start with the physical impact. And most of these are medical impacts on the baby. Key concepts here are that development occurs early and quickly. I'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide. Development continues up to and after birth. And then small effects early on can have great overall impacts on the infant's health. So if we look at the first trimester, a rudimentary heart is already developed and pumping by 5 weeks after 5 weeks after that last menstrual period date. So 5 weeks into the pregnancy, you already have a rudimentary heart developed. The structure of the spinal cord and brain are completely differentiated by 7 weeks. So things that might be toxic to the development of this baby are already in play before the mother may even know that she's pregnant. All the major organs are differentiated by 7 weeks. So the vast majority of what we would consider congenital birth defects have already occurred before some women even know that they're pregnant. And the importance of this is that the mother's health and her preconception health are critically important to the long-term development of that baby. Not only does that development occur early, but it continues all the way through birth, all the way through term, or 40 weeks. So if you think about a baby that's just born a few weeks early, that still has critical consequences to the baby's long-term health. During the last 8 weeks of this pregnancy, from 32 to 40, you see that the baby size doubles, goes from 1,700 grams to 3,500 grams. And even over the last 4 weeks, the baby gains a third of its weight. Not only, so weight is an easy thing to measure and to see, but in addition, all the development of these organs, they continue to mature through this time. So if we look at the brain, and I want you to just look at the two on the bottom, from 32 weeks to 40 weeks, a large amount of growth and maturation occurs in the brain, especially in the cerebral cortex, which is that part of the brain that controls our higher thinking. Those cells that end up in the cerebral cortex begin in the internal parts of the brain, and they migrate to the cortex through these weeks, really through weeks 22 through 40. But as you can see in this slide, quite a bit in those final 8 weeks. While those cells are in migration or transit, they're at higher risk and so babies that are born premature, small insults to them like low blood sugar or low oxygen levels, even though they may be brief, can do damage and can kill off these brain cells. And so when we look at babies that are born premature, and if we scan their brains when they're a few years old, we notice that the volume of their cerebral cortex is lower. So this is my son, Ty, and I just thought I'd share him with you. He was born at 28 weeks, and he was also low birth weight, and he needs to stop drinking so much coffee because he's a pretty active kid. So going back to the physical impact that low birth weight babies have. So what does prematurity do? Well, one of the things it does is it removes the baby from a protective environment. So hopefully in a healthy mom who's not ingesting any toxins or substances, the uterus is a protected place for that baby to be, and it's promoting the optimum growth. But by being born premature, we have now taken the baby out of that protective space. It exposes the baby to physiologic stressors. Babies that are born premature have to do things that they are not quite, their organs are not set to do. Their lungs need to start breathing. They need to start moving air and exchanging oxygen. And that affects the development of those lungs. The tissue of the lung in utero is floating in amniotic fluid. It allows that tissue to grow without any pressure on it. But once the baby's born, that fluid goes away and they need to start breathing, opening and closing those lungs. And that causes physical stress to those lungs. It causes trauma to the lungs. It causes scar tissue. And so it's not unusual for babies born premature to have lifelong respiratory problems. It exposes the baby to stimuli such as sight, such as visual, light, that part of the brain was not yet supposed to be focusing on. And it's difficult to determine the long-term consequences of some of these things. But light and sound are, clearly they're seen with much more. I'm not quite messing on the word here, but it's quite a larger exposure to the baby than it would be if the baby's in utero. Light's most obvious, but it's more than that. It's touch, it's pressure on parts of the body. The baby is no longer floating in that protective fluid. It also forces the baby to expend a lot of energy that the baby wouldn't normally need to expend. So a lot of waste material that occurs in the baby as it's developing goes across the umbilical cord and ends up in the mother's circulation, and mom gets rid of that for the baby. Whereas now that the baby's born, the baby's liver needs to do that. Well, that requires energy. Nutrition to the baby comes directly across the umbilical cord. So the baby is getting glucose and amino acids and fat and all the things that the baby needs to build tissue. Well, now that the baby's born, all of that is stopped. And the baby has to expend energy to ingest proteins in order to then break them down into the components that it can use. And all of this puts a stress on that baby and takes energy away from development and puts it towards just growing. The physical impact of just being born premature, it affects every system of the baby's body. The breathing system I discussed a little bit. It affects the heart, the gastrointestinal tract. Those intestines were not meant to be absorbing nutrients yet. But not only that, but within 1 to 2 days after being born, that intestinal tract is now colonized with bacteria. And that is going to create a lifelong effect on the way those intestines work. It also puts the baby at higher risk for infection because the natural barriers to protect the baby from infection, when the baby's in utero and is growing and developing, the baby's in a sterile environment. Once the baby's born, they're exposed to bacteria and viruses from the moment they're born. And then it also affects the development of the neurologic system, the brain, as I went earlier and showed you how much development and maturation occurs in just the final 8 weeks. And all of this leads to increased long-term consequences as well as increased mortality rates in babies that are born premature and low birth weight. If we want to talk about moving on to the impact that this has socially on the family, it removes the infant from the mother. Remember those first 2 babies I showed you. One of the baby is in a sterile environment with no contact from his mother. Even if the baby was in the womb, he would still have continuous contact with his mother. Whereas now that the baby is born, baby's been removed from mom. And we try to include the mother as much as we can with the baby's care. And I should be saying father at this point because that's so important also. However, we can only do so much because some of the interventions we put in place to protect the baby require them to be isolated from that mother. It also removes the mother from the family and from her other children and from her spouse. Some of these babies are in the hospitals for months. That requires a major lifestyle change for this family, and the mother requiring many more hours in the hospital away from her other children, from parents. This has become even more evident with how we're dealing with COVID as we're restricting all visitors into the hospital. It increases distress between parents and other children, and it increases distress between the parents and each other. Separation rates are much higher among families within a year or two of having a low birth weight or premature baby than they are after having a full-term baby. It creates isolation, parents from each other, parents from other support systems, and parents from society. Mothers report being overprotective, unwilling to have friends and family visit, uncomfortable leaving the infant with other caregivers. Infants have been shown to be less explorative. So as you watch these babies over the first few years of life, they're less likely to initiate things on their own, to be willing to go off and experiment and try new things, which are obviously very important for our development. They're more likely, as this proceeds, as they get older, to have learning disabilities. And then as adults, they're less likely to attend higher education. All of these things have an impact on their long-term financial gain. Moving on to finance and the impact that having a low birth weight baby has on them. I'll start with a quote from Derek Buck, he's president of Harvard. He said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. And then I like to make a correlation to that, which is if you think healthcare is expensive, try illness. And so whenever I hear people talk about how we can't afford universal healthcare, the first thing I reply back is that we can't afford not to have universal healthcare. So let's just talk about the impact of that low birth weight or prematurity has as far as that initial hospitalization. So I'm just concentrating on while the baby is in the hospital immediately after birth. If you look at the average NICU admission cost, it's $76,000 a year. This comes from the March of Dimes. Obviously, there's a large range. We have babies who are in the NICU for 1 or 2 days and babies that are in the NICU for upwards to a year. But if we look at the average cost, it's $76,000, and this is from 2017. If you look at the average cost for routine delivery, it's $2,500. So if you're charged more than $2,500, then you need to call your hospital. No, I'm gonna get in trouble for saying that. But anyway, it's $2,500. So there's a considerable difference here. So in essence, the NICU cost per baby comes out to about $73,500, okay? There are 3.8 million births a year in the United States, and 15% of those babies are admitted to the NICU. So if we do the calculation of 3.8 million births times 15% times that additional cost of $73,500, it equals close to $42 billion. So anything we can do to help prevent low birth weight babies being born low birth weight, or babies being premature, or babies being admitted to the NICU, has the potential to save our society a large amount of money. Remember, this is just the initial hospitalization. This is not talking about the future financial impact that having a baby low birth weight and premature has. The impact also occurs financially on the family. They have a lot of increased personal costs. Missed work is a big part of it. In a study in England, they found that there was a 22 to 30% decline in family income during the year after a baby is born premature. They have increased personal costs. I knew one mother who went and lived in St. Louis for close to 9 months after her baby was born. That separated her from her husband. It created lots of financial costs for living there. But also she had to quit work in order to do that. You have increased medical bills. And even if you have insurance, everyone knows what these new high deductibles and higher out of pocket and higher long-term financial costs, the greater amount of that medical bill is being passed on to the family. And then of course, after the baby is discharged home, they're rehospitalized, and that creates financial burdens on the family. Long-term wise, it has both cost to the child and to society. And I've spoken about this before, but there's something called the fetal origin of disease. And this is something that's been shown very clearly to occur in babies that are born low birth weight. And they have a higher risk of type 2 diabetes, coronary artery disease, hypertension, stroke, and obesity. All of these are major costs of healthcare dollars in today's society. And so anything that we can do, of course, to reduce these, and one of them would be to have more babies born healthy and of normal birth weight, would provide some substantial cost savings to us as a country, as a society. So I like to tell people, even if you don't care about the baby and you're a very selfish individual who's narcissistic and only care about yourself, you should still want to prevent low birth weight and want to provide whatever we need to do in order to have healthy babies, because this will benefit you in the future. So part of the ways to get to a solution and to see how we could solve this problem is to determine why babies are born low birth weight. And as you probably already know or suspect, there's lots of different reasons. Some of them which we can control and some which we cannot. Placental problems. Some placental problems occur just because of the way the uterus is shaped, or because of where the egg implants, with no with no problem from or no input from the mother. However, some also placental problems are caused by maternal tobacco use and smoking. It causes the placenta to be more likely to be overlying the cervix, which puts the pregnancy at risk for bleeding. It also, there's more likely for something called a placental abruption, which is where the placenta starts to come off early, which of course can be deadly both to mother, to baby, but also result in prematurity and low birth weight. Premature rupture of membranes and preterm labor are very common causes of prematurity and low birth weight. Multiple gestation. It kind of stands to reason that if there's more babies in there, there's only so much room, and eventually the uterus will start to get some of those signals to go ahead and deliver. Genetic conditions in the baby or in the mother can lead to low birth weight and prematurity. Alcohol, drugs, and cigarette use. Maternal health is a huge indicator and one that we can have a direct effect on. And then infections. So moving on to the impact which you can have, I hope that everybody who is listening to this presentation realizes that you can have an impact on the life of another person. And I think that is the first step in really valuing what you do. I'm very fortunate in that I get to directly see the impact that I have. I have a baby that's struggling to breathe. I do an intervention, place them on a ventilator, give them surfactant, and see them start to breathe more comfortably. I then take care of that baby for 4 to 8 weeks, and I get to send them home and watch the family carry out this healthy baby. And then I'm even more fortunate when I'm at the water park and some 3-year-old runs up to me because they're being forced to by their mom and gives me a hug because I took care of them, and I get to see that impact. A lot of the impact that you have, you may not see. You don't know how your intervention made a difference in a mother's life and helped her to start making those steps to have a more healthy pregnancy and to deliver a full-term baby. But I can tell you that if you've had that impact, which I'm sure many of you have, and a lot of the programs, both through Healthy Start and Missouri Regional Boot Heel Consortium have had that impact. That impact is so much greater than mine because it helped to prevent all of these problems from the start. So you're actually part of the solution, whereas I'm just treating the problem. So you can have an impact, and understanding that we change the world one life at a time, I think is critical for all of us. You can have an impact on maternal health. I don't know what this screen part is showing, but anyway, you can have an impact on maternal health. healthy mothers are more likely to have healthy babies. It seems so obvious, but for some reason, it's listening to that presentation on Healthy Start, I see how 20, 30 years ago, we're kind of dealing with the same problems today as they were dealing with then. You know, advocate for universal health care, advocate for increased access to health care, because all of you know, having health insurance doesn't mean you have access to health care. Encourage women to see a healthcare professional. Encourage women to have a healthy lifestyle. Encourage women to take their medications. An example there would be in diabetes and hypertension, which have critical effects on the development of the baby, put the baby at higher risk for low birth weight. But a lot of mothers who don't, you know, unfortunately, we're much better at taking care of other people than we are taking care of ourselves, and really reinforcing to these young moms or old moms or any moms, pregnant women, that taking care of themselves is taking care of their baby. Jordan Peterson, who some of you may or may not like, says many interesting things, but one of the things he says is, treat yourself as if you're somebody you care about. We do much better in taking care of other people than we do ourselves. You can have an impact on fetal development. Development begins prior to conception. I'm not really in contact with the mothers during this time, and you guys are. And so stressing to these young women to try to improve their health before they get pregnant is critical. Optimum interchild spacing is 3 to 5 years. That shows you just how long it takes a mother to heal from having a baby, so that her body is in optimum health to then support the development of another baby. Maternal substance use. I often would get the question, we're thinking of getting pregnant, at what point should I stop drinking? The answer is now. Not that I have anything against having a glass of wine or drinking a beer, but if you're getting pregnant, then I do have a thing against it, because no alcohol has been shown to be safe during pregnancy. I'll stop smoking after I get pregnant, changes to I'll stop smoking after the baby is born, changes to I'll stop smoking once the baby comes home from the hospital. Really, stopping smoking before you even get pregnant would be helpful, both for the mother's health and the baby's health. Maternal nutrition, we know this affects the development of the baby. Folic acid supplementation has a huge decrease in the risk of neural tube defects. This image shows you where the posterior part of the baby's neural tube did not fuse, and therefore the brain is herniated out. And supplementing with folic acid prior to conception will help decrease that. Preconceptional glucose control determines the risk of birth defects in a woman who has diabetes. So developing good control afterwards, while that will affect the health of that developing fetus, the risk on birth defects actually occurs on the glucose control prior to getting pregnant. So we know maternal health has a direct effect on the health of the baby. You can have a huge impact by helping with deter maternal substance abuse. In Missouri, and this is more recent data than some that I presented earlier, 21% of adults continue to smoke, and pregnant women, 15% are self-reported as smoking. These numbers may be higher. Alcohol is 15%, even though we know that no amount of alcohol is safe during a pregnancy. Marijuana is 10%, and others, including opiates, 1 to 2%. Sometimes I think there's this myth out there, what I call the placental defense system, which is that the placenta creates this impenetrable shield around the developing fetus. But the truth is, it's really not like that. It's more like a game of Pong. And as you can see, this one's already let 8 harmful substances through. So, I think that it's very critical for mothers to understand that anything they ingest into their body is really being ingested by the fetus. Fetal alcohol syndrome, small eyes, thin upper lip, small philtrum, intrauterine growth restriction, developmental delay, learning disabilities. This fetal alcohol syndrome can cause severe cerebral palsy in babies, lifetime behavioral issues, anger control management, and situations like that, directly related to the mother's ingestion of alcohol. It's normally associated with binge drinking, but as we've said, as I've said in numerous times, there is no considered safe amount during a pregnancy. Cigarette use, low birth weight, secondary to fetal asphyxia. So if you think about that, the reason why the baby is small is because the blood vessels coming from the mother to the baby are constricting while the mother's smoking, and it's actually decreasing the blood flow to the baby. You know, no mother would actively suffocate their baby, and yet that's what's occurring kind of in small amounts while they smoke. Cigarette use also leads to an increased risk in preterm birth. Placental problems, as I mentioned earlier, like placenta previa and placental abruption. Opiate addiction, 1 to 3% of all pregnancies. Pregnancy complications, birth defects, growth restriction, placental abruption, preterm labor, meconium, which really is just an indication that the baby has been stressed and is therefore past its first stool prior to birth. Maintenance programs are important, and they've been shown to reduce the risk of street use, which is also very important. I'm going to go back here just for a sec, because when parents are using drugs that they've acquired on the street, of course, you don't really know what they're getting there. And there's a lot more toxins, and then the dosing is a lot different, and the risk both to the mother and to the baby is increased. Maintenance programs have been shown to decrease cravings and therefore decrease the number of street use drugs. However, it can lead to neonatal abstinence syndrome and withdrawal symptoms in the baby. That's just something that we're willing to deal with because of the protection we get from having the mother not using any illicit drugs. And then here's two more of my kids, Olive and Ty. These two babies were born, they're not babies anymore, but they were born premature at 28 weeks with low birth weight. They are thriving. You can have an impact during the first year. I want you to encourage the women that you see and father's involvement. I need to keep throwing that into my presentations. Continuation of maintaining a healthy lifestyle. So many parents discount the importance of them and their children's growth and development. So really empower those parents to realize the impact that they have on their children. Encourage follow-up with healthcare workers. Help prevent sudden infant death. You guys are the ones who are talking to the families. Low birth weight babies are at higher risk. Sudden infant death is the leading cause of death between age 1 month and a year, about 1 per 1,000 births. It is 3 times higher in the African American and American Indian populations. 15-20% will occur in childcare settings, and that a lot of those will occur in home childcare settings. So it's really important that those safe sleep practices occur both, while at home, but with anyone who is taking care of your child. Co-sleeping can be deadly. Nobody would put their baby to sleep with a knife or a hatchet in bed with them, and yet that's kind of the risk that they're taking when they co-sleep with their baby. Sudden infant death, the rate has decreased by 50% since adopting the Back to Sleep campaign. You can make an impact by reducing SIDS. The 2 things I tell every family I discharge from the hospital is always place your baby to sleep on their back. That is the safest way for a baby to sleep. And always place your baby to sleep in their own space, in a crib or a bassinet, with no bumpers or stuffed animals. The baby does not see any of that stuff, and none of that is for the baby's benefit. Some things that are protective for babies that will help prevent SIDS. Breastfeeding has been shown to be protective. Sleeping in the same room with the parents for the first year of life. Pacifier use. Having a fan, not blowing directly on the baby, but just having a fan that helps to circulate air in the room. And then getting immunizations because of the benefit of not getting those childhood illnesses. protective having this baby sleeping in its own space on its back in the room next to mom. This is Olive. This is one of those babies that was born at 28 weeks that I've told you about. Here she is, well, probably about 3 years ago. I had a video of her doing a back handspring, but unfortunately I wasn't able to load it. I couldn't figure out how to get it from my phone to the computer. But I do have a picture of Iris doing a dance for you.
I'm a savage, yeah. Classy, bougie, ratchet, yeah. Sassy, moody, nasty, yeah. Acting stupid, what's happening? What's happening? I'm a savage, yeah.
Iris, I'd like to thank you for listening to my
Hey,
presentation.
so you back.
And I'd be happy to take any questions or we can move on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crusoe. I was going to ask you, we do have a couple questions in the chat box. Do you mind answering those in the chat box?
Oh, no problem at all. I'll just have to
Okay.
figure out how to do
We're
that.
running a little behind schedule, so we're
I
going to move
understand.
on, but I do know there is some questions in the chat box for you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, next we have Catrice Kane is going to be speaking. So if you want to go ahead and share your screen, Catrice.
Will do. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Okay, we see it. Awesome.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can hear you and I can see you.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you again, Dr. Caruso, and we are ready for you to go, Catrice. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, for having me. Greetings from Cleveland, Ohio. It is a pleasure to be here with you all to talk about some of the work that we are doing. I want to thank Dr. Caruso and Ms. Fraser for the setup because I was listening intently, and they really set up a lot of what I will be discussing today. So thank you for touching on everything and those phenomenal presentations. So I want to take a few moments throughout my presentation to provide an overview of First Year Cleveland, some infant mortality data relevant to our city and our county. I know in previous presentations there was some phenomenal national data provided. I want to talk a little bit about racism and how it contributes to racial inequities, and then discuss some of our engagement strategies. As mentioned, this month is National Infant Mortality Awareness Month. So for us here in Cleveland at First Year Cleveland, this is a special time for us to really have these authentic, intentional, honest conversation about what's happening with our babies in our communities. First Year Cleveland was established in 2015 by 13 civic leaders. We have an advisory committee of over 400 community partners. That's our larger group. And we focus on a grassroots bottom-up approach. And we believe that you cannot do anything for us without us. So that's important that we draw on the experience and the wisdom and the voices of our community members, especially those within the Black community. Often, too many times, we create these collaboratives, these initiatives, these programs and services, and we leave them out of the decision-making process, that table. Our vision is that every baby born in Cuyahoga County will celebrate a first birthday, and that we can do this by mobilizing the community through partnership and a unified strategy to reduce infant deaths and racial inequities. So back in 2015, 3 priority areas were established. The first one, to reduce racial inequities. The second one, to address extreme prematurity, which is the leading cause of infant mortality in our community, and then to address sleep-related infant deaths. And within those 3 priority areas, we have 11 action teams. And these action teams focus on research studies, initiatives, activities, programmings to address one of these top 3 priority areas. This is just a slide just to make sure we're all on the same page in case anyone does not know the formal definition of infant mortality, but it is the death of a baby before his or her first birthday. And then I have listed how we calculate the infant mortality rate. And I just throw that in there as we begin this presentation. And we know that when we talk about infant mortality, oftentimes people want to say this is a healthcare issue. This is an issue of, a certain organization, of a certain group. No, this is a community issue. This is an us issue. And it's really a reflection. It's a mirror reflecting our collective capacities to promote and protect our most youngest and most vulnerable. These are our precious babies that are not seeing these milestones that we were able to experience, that maybe our children were able to experience. We have to put that in context of what infant mortality is. We have to remember that this is the life, and losing one baby is one too many. But the fact that we have a crisis in this nation is disheartening. It's disheartening, it saddens me, and it angers me. So we have to do something collectively and think about this as a unified issue that we must address. We know that infant mortality reflects a society's commitment to the high quality of care, to adequate food and good nutrition, safe and stable housing, the psychological and physical environment, and sufficient income to prevent impoverishment. And as you can see, 2 through 5 are those non-clinical measures. So a lot of that is about that community care outside of the walls of the hospital, as I mentioned before. For us in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, our work began with really making sure that we understood what the data was telling us. For so long in our community, a lot of programs and initiatives were built on assumptions. And it's important that we use the data, we use the voices of the community to truly understand what is going on here and why has it happened for so long in our community. So we know that for us in our community, this is not just an issue solely around the lack of prenatal care. Our women are receiving it during the first trimester early on. This isn't an issue solely on poverty. This isn't an issue solely on teen pregnancy or alcohol or substance abuse. So we took this information and make sure that we incorporate it into all of the work that we do. So here's what we do know. That Black mothers are more than twice as likely as white mothers to have a baby with low birth weight, the same as high incidence of premature babies. We know that this issue around infant mortality has occurred within our county for the past 50 years. We've had one of the highest infant mortality rates for the past 50 years. We know that Black babies die 3 times the rate of white babies, and that this is across socioeconomic status, that Black women with advanced degrees have a higher rates of pregnancy and infant mortality, or pregnancy loss and infant mortality, than white women with less than a GED. And we know that it just doesn't stop when we talk about that first year of life, that even if we can get that baby past his or her first birthday, we have to recognize what that baby will experience and could face and the challenges they're faced with year after year after their life. So Cleveland is the 5th to the 10th most segregated city in the nation. And think about the historical context of that disinvestment in certain communities, particularly Black and brown communities. That if you travel less than 10 miles from Cleveland's inner city neighborhoods to more affluent outer ring suburb, the life expectancy can differ as much as 12 years. 10 miles in between 2 inner city and an outer ring suburb, and the difference in that life expectancy is 12 years. The median income for white residents is 2 times that of Black residents. And I want to pay attention closely to this last bullet, because just 9 months ago, there was a study that showed that Cleveland is the worst large city in the entire United States for Black women's livability. The worst large city. So when we talk about infant mortality, when we talk about Black infant mortality, that we have to put into context what this bullet point means. And with that, we think about the legacy of slavery. We think about 400 years of Black Americans being in the United States. And what does that story tell us? 246 years in slavery, 99 years of Jim Crow. I put in quotation marks, 56 years of us being equal. And that's over 400 years. That's 87% of the Black experience, either enslaved or under Jim Crow. So think about slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and these policies that have been put in place to prevent Black people from having the optimal care, health and wellness. And here's how we define racism using the definition from Dr. Kamara Jones, a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which we know that to be of race, that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities while unfairly advantaging others. And it saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So here's where we're at now. We know that Black babies in the United States die 2 times the rate as white babies, that in the state of Ohio, Black babies die 3 times the rate as white babies, that in Cuyahoga County, Black babies die 4 times the rate as white babies. And in the city of Cleveland, Black babies die as high as 7 times the rate of white babies. And we have this local data, but we know that there's also national data on this. We know that the literature tells us the same story of how racism impacts infant health outcomes. We know the impact that maternal stress has on pregnancy and the risk for preterm birth, for the risk of low birth weight. We have prominent figures in our society who are starting to speak out, prominent Black women, influential women who are saying, it does not matter if I'm a multimillionaire. It does not matter that I may have the status and the wealth, that I still experience racism on a day-to-day basis, that I still received and experienced racism when I was giving birth to my child. And I thank them for telling their stories to show that this is a problem across socioeconomic status. And then we have these conversations about microaggressions when we talk about that maternal stress, when we talk about toxic stress. And the literature does show that racism in the form of microaggressions are what I call are actually aggressions. There's nothing micro about them. But the impact that they have on the risk of preterm birth, on the risk of infant mortality, on the risk of low birth weight. And these, when we talk about microaggressions, these are the comments that we often hear that you see on your screen. And I want to focus on one, which says that when I look at you, I don't see color. And I talk to my colleagues and I talk to people within the community about this particular comment all the time, because I understand what they're getting at. I see that they're saying that I'm not going to discriminate against you. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to treat you differently because of the color of your skin. But I always tell them to take that quote, take that phrase out of their vocabulary, that you have to see me as a Black woman. You have to see my skin color. Because if you do not, then you won't appreciate my experiences. You won't be able to hear my experiences when I tell you what I faced as a Black woman in a society. So I encourage everyone, if you particularly said this comment, that you remove it out of your vocabulary and that you just specifically say that because you are a Black person, because you are a brown person, that I will not look at you differently or treat you differently because of it. But when we talk about microaggressions being verbal or nonverbal communications that create hostile environments, these are the type of statements that create those hostile environments. And they can be easily explained away. Well, I didn't mean that. You know what I meant. There's no ill intent by that. But for those who are on the receiving end, we're in a position of how do we defend ourselves in that moment? How do we explain to someone that has offended us, that has made us feel a certain type of way? So I want you all to realize the impact of microaggressions, that racism doesn't always appear overtly as far as saying a racial slur, or telling someone you can't sit at this table because of your color of skin. It's not always that explicit, but it's these undertones. It's these very subtle comments that promote harm in so many ways. And then with the microaggressions, with this toxic stress, when we think about the racism, we have this concept of weathering that Dr. Arlene Geronimus talks about. And it says that it describes how the health of Black women deteriorates at a faster rate than white women because of the cumulative effects of racism and toxic stress. And it helps to explain why, as I mentioned before earlier, why Black women have the highest levels of education and still their babies are dying at higher rates than white women, while they still experience these high rates of pregnancy and loss, so miscarriage and stillbirth. So thinking about that over time, that 400 years of experience of racism in the society and how it's passed down generation to generation, and how it affects us throughout our entire life, from even once we pass and move past that first year of life until where we are right now, present day. So with all that being said, that sets up into what we do here at First Year Cleveland. We have 11 action teams, as I mentioned, but I'm going to focus on a few under the racial disparities priority area. And that's what I oversee at First Year Cleveland. This is the work that I oversee. Now, this work is woven into everything that we do at First Year Cleveland, but we do have specific action teams set up specifically to look at the Black infant mortality rate. One of our action teams, as I mentioned before, we can't continue to do work without really understanding the voices, understanding the experiences of women. So we conducted focus groups with about 50 women who were Black, Latina, and white. And we asked about their experiences during prenatal care, birth care, and postnatal care. And I'm sharing with you some of the excerpts from what they said during the focus group. The first one is, I was tired and my mother was speaking to me in Spanish because I was scared. The doctor stopped what he was doing, looked at me and said, this is an English speaking room only. Now think about that. In a moment where you go to a place where you're seeking care and that you're feeling scared and you have someone that you feel that should protect you, that should be there for you, that should provide the care that you need, that they tell you that you can't speak to the other person, your own flesh and blood, who you brought to this appointment as a support system, imagine what that feels like. Imagine what that message is telling us. I'm not welcomed. And not only that I'm not welcomed, my family's not welcomed. And I can't speak in the language that resonates with me and my family. I can't have this conversation. I can't talk to the person that I feel connected to the most, who is my mother. The second one is, with my first son, my man is dark and my son is light-skinned. They looked identical otherwise. This nurse looks over his shoulder and says, you know they do DNA tests for free. I just had a baby. No one knows what I dealt with during my pregnancy, what I experienced outside of the walls of the hospital. But after I experienced this pivotal moment in my life, I had a nurse telling me that I should get a DNA test because my baby is not the same complexion as his or her father. It's unacceptable. And that takes you back for us having to understand the 400 years of racism in our country, to understand the legacy of slavery. Because if slave owners had sex with slaves that produced mixed babies, then those babies more than likely did not have the same complexion as their mother. So what does that tell us? We see the legacy appear right in these conversations. Here's another one. I felt rushed to leave, but who was waiting at home for me? So you're rushing me out of a hospital or care, and I don't have a support system at home. No one's asked me, who am I going home to? No one's asking the questions of what support do I have after I leave with my baby? That's not a question, but the first thing is go. Thank you. Everything's finished. We're done with you. What is that message that the hospital is sending to this woman, to this community, that you don't care, that you don't belong? And lastly, we want the people who care for us to care. I am a person, not a product. And I love this quote because we are not numbers. We are beyond that. We're not check boxes. We're not figures in a chart to say how many patients this hospital has just cared for. We are individuals, and we need to treat people as individuals. Treat them as humans, not products, not an assembly line to get them in, have the baby, get them out as soon as possible, and get someone else in to occupy that room and get them out. That's not what this is. It's a hospital, a place for care, a system of care. So with that, what we learned from the women, and we learned there's many more quotes from that, and it was great focus groups, great discussions. And I will say that, of course, as we know from lived experiences and the data, that the experiences from the Black women and the the Black women and Latina women were vastly different than the experiences of the white women. So from that, we created these posters. And these posters are bias awareness posters. It's a campaign that we're having in our 3 major healthcare systems. And the purpose of them is to take those quotes from the women, to place them in these posters. When a clinician, a leader, or staff clicks on the QR code, you will see these videos. And we only show a partial portion of the women, but we do have, you can see their face, you can see their nose down. And you hear their stories and their experiences. We don't identify which system they received care from, but it is clear, and we do make it aware that they did attend and receive care for one of our 3 major hospital systems. And why is this important? Is because these posters are only in the clinical areas, so it's not around patients. They can't see it. It's not by the cafeteria. It's just in the clinical areas. And we wanted to make sure that our hospitals realize that as much as you think that you're doing and the care you're providing is good, you may have banners, you may be on rankings, hospital rankings. We have some phenomenal healthcare systems in Cleveland, and we're proud of them for what they do. But we have to recognize when we talk about racism and bias in healthcare, this is just not a national scale. I think people tend to forget that and disconnect from that piece. We have to raise the point that this is happening right here in our backyards. So when I go into OBGYN, when I go into pediatrics, when I go into certain departments, I say, you may look around and say that your department is doing everything great, but there are patients that receive care within this department that said otherwise. And we need to address that. So these are our posters. They're in the clinical areas, as I mentioned, and it's been great conversation starters. It's been a great way for us to talk about racism, to talk about bias, to really take a deeper dive into patient care, patient experience, and some of the surveys that our hospitals put out that patients may or may not complete. And so from that posters, that's the awareness piece of it, but then we have the actual bias training. And this is for healthcare systems, leaders, clinicians, and staff. And we really say it has to be all patient point of contact. Because you may have a great relationship with your healthcare provider, but you may go into a doctor's appointment one day and maybe it's the parking attendant. Maybe it's the front desk person who says something, who does something that shifts your whole mood, that changes your entire experience. So we can't say that this is, bias training is just for the doctors or the nurses. No, everyone who will encounter a patient needs bias training. We all have bias. So we have to be fully aware of our biases and how to mitigate them. But we do specifically focus on OBGYN, NICU, pediatrics, and emergency departments, because a lot of women are going to the ED when they have pregnancy concerns, pregnancy issues. They may not have a healthcare provider, a primary healthcare provider. They may not know of an OBGYN doctor for many different reasons. So a lot of our focus recently has been on the emergency departments to make sure they are equipped to handle when a woman comes into the department for assistance, support, care. And then HR transformation. That's the biggest thing. So who are we hiring as our doctors and our clinicians and our leaders? We have to think about our HR policies and practices and procedures. When something happens and an employee states that they encountered something with their colleague that was racist or biased, or a situation of that nature, how is our healthcare systems handling that issue? How are they taking care of that? So a lot of our work has really been around the practices, the policies, the programs, and then the people that we have in place. The people have to reflect the communities that we are serving. That's ideal. You have to understand. I'm not saying that there aren't white physicians that don't provide quality care, that don't think about the cultural context of patients. I've had white physicians who I've loved, who've been phenomenal. We've had a great patient-provider relationship. But we do have to recognize that some patients do prefer someone who looks like them. That either way, we need to diversify this workforce when it comes into healthcare. So we have the poster awareness campaign that we do within hospital systems. We have the bias training that's specifically focused on maternal and infant health care, and that does have a historical context that talks about racism. So that is built into our bias trainings. And then one of our action teams, the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Committee, they created a short film that's called Toxic: A Black Woman's Story. So everything that I talked to you about earlier about the socioeconomic status, about weathering, toxic stress, racism, that impact on maternal infant health outcomes is addressed in this film. The lead character is a successful lawyer. We want to make sure that we change the narrative. And it's been a great educational tool. And along with PALE and the Healthy Neighborhoods Committee of Healthy Cleveland Initiative, they came together and they said, you know, we have to help educate our community. We have to put a face to these inequities that we see, because some people just still don't understand the connection between racism and maternal infant health outcomes. So this film has been an educational tool that we've screened and shown throughout the entire county, throughout our neighborhoods, overall in the state. We're selling it and the proceeds go to support Black families who've experienced loss. I actually have another screening this afternoon with some corporations, which we're really excited about because they want to learn what they can do to address infant mortality. So this is our educational tool, and we've also been showing it during our medical grand rounds. So those departments that I mentioned before, and that's within our 3 major healthcare systems. And there's always a discussion following the screening of the film. We said at the very beginning that we just can't show this film and walk away. So every time we screen it, we have a discussion. We talk about things specifically geared to the audience that is watching that film. And if you want to learn more about Toxic, if you want to see the trailer, feel free to go to toxicshortfilm.com or contact me after this presentation. So that's what we did within the systems, but we knew that there was support that we also needed for our community members, those who have been affected. So the entire family, the village, as I call them. And we created our wellness network. This is another initiative out of the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Committee of First Year Cleveland. And this is a network that provides emotional and mental support for families in our community. So those families who are pregnant, expected parents, or have experienced miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant loss. And the importance of OWN is that it is comprised of all Black mental health professionals and peer support specialists that you see in this photo. There is a need for mental health support. And when we talk to parents, when we talk to those who were pregnant, expecting, or who had experienced loss, they said, I don't have someone I can go to talk to. I don't have someone who looks like me that I can talk to. When I experienced my loss, I was needing that support, and I didn't get it from the healthcare systems. They told me that my baby died, and they sent me out, out to go out back home and try to figure out what this new normal is. You know, I'm pregnant, I'm dealing with stress, I have so much going on, I need someone to talk to, but I don't have someone who understands me, who looks like me. So we created this network, and it's really created to really address the needs of Black families in our communities. It's open to everyone, no matter your race or ethnicity, but we specifically focus on African Americans because of that gap of services. And then we have the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Society, which is a group of men and women who've experienced pregnancy and infant loss. They come together, they plan events, remembrance events, they support one another. This great community of women and men who just said, you know what, we want to be able to support each other to honor our angel babies, as we call them, those who have gone too soon, and to help bring awareness to the community at whole. This is what pregnancy and infant loss looks like. You know, let's come together. Let's do something to protect our babies, to make sure that they survive and thrive. And there's a lot of prevention work that they do as well. So these are a few pictures of some of our members, and they're phenomenal. And there goes our logo at the top. Hope is here, we are here. Speaking of the PALE Society, every year on October 15th, which is Pregnancy and Infant Loss Remembrance Day, in October is Pregnancy and Infant Loss Remembrance Month, they hold an event titled Wave of Light. This is a national event. And it's a way for our community to remember and honor our angel babies. So there's a program and then a candle lighting ceremony. So you can see the picture of the parents. They're making the candles, they hand make them. They put the babies' names on them. And then, you know, pre-COVID, we would meet at the Cleveland Botanical Garden for the actual ceremony. And the significance of this event is that you have to think about it. When a baby dies, you don't have those milestones. You don't have those graduations. These parents aren't able to hear their babies' names being called for a graduation or a ceremony or a school event. So it's very important for the parents to put their heart and their soul and everything into making sure that this event is a success. Because everyone who registers, who provides the name of their baby who passed away due to miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant loss, is able to get a candle with their baby's name on it and have their baby's name read during the ceremony. And when I tell you this is a beautiful moment, it saddens me that we have to meet under these circumstances, but it warms my heart that we're able to create these programs and these events in such a meaningful way. Other ways that we support our expectant new parents are our doula program. So we don't provide direct service through First Year Cleveland, but we do fund programs and initiatives that do. So we have doula programs, our home visiting, case management, health education, the support of community health workers, centering pregnancy, which is group prenatal care. As mentioned before, we always emphasize the importance of fatherhood programs. When we talk to our fathers, they say, you know, we're left out of the conversation. We want to be included. You know, we want to know everything that our spouse knows. We want to be actively involved despite what others may think, despite what the media may portray as men not caring. We do care, and please include us in those conversations, and please have programming just for us so we can gather with other men and we can talk and we can share our concerns and our challenges, and also our milestones, our rewards, the things that we're excited about that we're doing as a father. You know, are waiting for the arrival of our baby. So we do support fatherhood programs, our Safe Sleep Heroes, as Dr. Caruso mentioned, the ABCDs of safe sleep, so a baby alone on his or her back, in a crib, and don't smoke around the baby. And that leads into the smoking cessation programs, and then working with our faith-based initiatives. So we have something called Safe Sleep Sundays that we had pre-COVID, where the churches would get together and share messages about the ABCDs of safe sleep, talk about infant mortality, and that's another way to engage our community and our organizations. But I do want to say this. I want to say that this slide of these programs that we have been successful. They've been helpful, but many of them are focused on helping families through, around, and over obstacles that they may face. And we have to realize that sometimes they only represent temporary solutions. So after that pregnancy ends, after we return them back to their homes, we're essentially returning them into the same circumstances that required those programs and those services to begin with. And then the cycle repeats itself. So I, support these programming, but we can't be so focused on programs, and services. We have to get to the root of it. And why continue to treat people's illnesses without changing the conditions that make them sick to begin with? The root cause. While the mother is the environment of the developing fetus, the community is the environment of the mother. And when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. So I've seen so many initiatives that are essentially blaming and shaming women and men. You're not doing this, do enough that. And I'm saying we need to change our focus. Yes, there's support that's needed for individuals, but we have to take the time to address the deep-rooted issues within our environment, within their environment, within our communities. And a part of that work is what Cleveland has done to declare racism as a public health crisis. And I love this quote from Race For It. It says, structural racism has always been a pre-existing condition. And I mentioned that because even in lieu of COVID-19, people are talking about pre-existing conditions. But we never talked about the biggest one, the underlying one of all the other chronic diseases that were mentioned as pre-existing conditions. It's racism. It's individual, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic racism. So our Cleveland City Council declared racism as a public health crisis, and this was an effort of First Year Cleveland, of NAACP, Cleveland chapter, of Urban League Greater Cleveland, of YWCA Greater Cleveland, of Birthing Beautiful Communities, which is a Black-led doula program in Cleveland, and of United Way, because as I mentioned, we do have support of the corporate sector. So these organizations came together and we approached and had hearings with Cleveland City Council and said, look, here we are, 400 years, over 400 years of racism in our country. What are we gonna do? What are we gonna do about our infant mortality problem, this crisis that we have? We have to examine our systems, our practices, our policies. We have to create mechanisms to measure, to support this work. We have to realize that something's going on in our community, the fact that our babies aren't seeing their first birthday. And racism is the issue. So we're gonna have to be disruptive. We're gonna have to change things. We're gonna have to be proactive. We're gonna have to continue that good fight. But we need some system level changes in our community across all sectors. This isn't just healthcare. This is education. This is our workforce. This is criminal justice. This is the environment. These are neighborhoods, all together. So that's our efforts right now, to address those core issues, those deep issues that are contributing to not just infant mortality, but all the inequities that we see. And we have to promote equitable systems throughout our city. Cuyahoga County has also declared racism as a public health crisis. Within the state of Ohio, we are leading with the state with the most cities to declare racism as a public health crisis, and we have 23 cities. So there's some opportunities to collaborate locally, statewide, and I hope that we can collaborate also across the country, because we know that there are other states that have also made this declaration. So that is some of the work that we have done within Cleveland to understand this problem that we have around maternal infant health outcomes, and to find ways to address it at the system level, to provide support at the individual level, and then realize that collectively as a city, as I mentioned, this isn't just a hospital issue. This isn't just one sector issue. This isn't just the health department issue. That's why this declaration is so important, because we're bringing together key stakeholders to say that we are committed. We're going to acknowledge that racism exists, and that we're going to do whatever we can to do to dismantle it. And that's what this declaration means. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to answer them if you want to go into a deeper dive, but I thank you for your time and listening to what we're doing here.
Oh, yes, I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Catrice. That was wonderful. I do know that there is a question in the chat box, if you don't mind to respond to that, like how Dr. Caruso did.
Will do.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Sue is going to present. Sue, hi, Sue. Susan,
Hi.
Do you want to try to share your screen?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you again, Catrice.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I don't know, you guys put me behind two phenomenal speakers. So Dr. Caruso and Ms. Kane, thank you so much. Those were perfect presentations, and I'm going to start by saying, if you listen to nothing I say and just listen to them, it all goes together. So thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I believe the slides are going to be available to everyone. Is that correct? Okay. I'm going to try to go through this really quickly because I know you have another really good speaker behind me, and I'm in the boot heel all the time. So I'm happy to talk with anybody anytime about that. And what I'd really like to do today and again, the prior speakers really teed this up nicely, is to really talk about that link between maternal health and infant health. And importantly, I really want to celebrate the boot heel, because we have two fabulous programs in, well, one fabulous program in the boot heel. We have many, but one new program in the boot heel, and then a statewide program that actually were born in the boot heel. And I think you need to really celebrate the strength in this area and talk about a national strategy to improve women's health, because we know that if women are healthy, communities are healthy. So just as the community is the environment where the woman grows, if the woman is supported and is healthy throughout her lifespan, we have the opportunity to have better maternal and infant health outcomes. This quote came from a gentleman from Rwanda who participated in a global maternal health summit that HRSA hosted about 2 years ago. And I think it's a really powerful quote, because if a baby dies, the mother cannot be well. And if the mother dies, the baby cannot be well. And I think that really speaks to the connectedness, and whether either the mother or the baby are physically healthy, having the loss of one or the other has a lifelong effect. And the loss of both can have a lifelong effect on the entire family. So many of the programs that we're talking about actually grew out of looking at infant mortality. But we know that, even with the Healthy Start program, for example, Healthy Start started looking at improving infant mortality. And yet we know that for the history of that program, you all have been working with women and their families to make sure that entire family stays healthy during the pregnancy and postpartum period, because we know that supports infant health. I'm going to invite you to go to the link here, because you will see a video of Shalon Irving's story if you have not heard about Shalon. She was a PhD epidemiologist at the CDC, actually studying racial disparities, and lost her life 3 weeks postpartum after several attempts at trying to get care for the situation. It's a very powerful story, and I think underscores much of what was said in the prior presentations. When we think about infant mortality and maternal mortality, we really need to look at that continuum of women's health care. Unfortunately, or I suppose fortunately, because we know that the United States has a significant number of maternal deaths when compared to other developed countries. And what has resulted from that awareness is a lot of attention paid to what's happening during labor and delivery. And we know that that's really important, because if things go bad during labor and delivery, we want everybody to know what they're doing to respond and hopefully save that life and mitigate the problems. However, we've spent less time really looking at what happens prenatally, pre-pregnancy, prenatally, during the postpartum period. We've really only focused on about a 6-week period. And then there's that whole gap between pregnancies. So really, what's needing to happen is to really start looking at the continuum of women's health, because women's health and maternal health really occurs over the lifespan. And I would argue it occurs before this woman lifespan even begins, because what her mother was exposed to and what happens during the pregnancy, or even before her mother was pregnant with her, has an impact on that woman's life and her future pregnancies as well. So it's all interconnected, and we really need to start looking at women's health. So why do we need this comprehensive approach? When we think about maternal mortality and women dying during pregnancy and postpartum, again, we've tended to focus on what happens during the delivery, but really, while there is a percentage, and if you look at this sort of orange part of the pie, there is about maybe a 20 to 30% rate of women dying at delivery or within the first week postpartum. And I think that is really important. What happens to that woman after she leaves the delivery room and after she leaves the hospital is tremendously important. So that time frame is something we really need to be thinking about. Likewise, we see about a quarter of those deaths occurring prenatally, another probably 20% or so occurring between 7 and 42 days postpartum, and the rest really occurring up until 1 year postpartum. And what are women dying from? Cardiovascular conditions, medical conditions, thromboemboli, cardiomyopathies, mental health. And when we see those deaths, particularly around cardiomyopathy and mental health, those tend to occur during that sort of mid-postpartum period, mid to late postpartum period, so around 6 months or so. Preeclampsia. We also see nationally causes of death, sort of seeing more Black women dying from those cardiac conditions, cardiomyopathy, cardiovascular disease, whereas we tend to see mental health conditions emerging as leading causes of death among white women nationally. Does that mean that all populations aren't affected? No, we need to be vigilant in looking for those things. But I think starting to realize that once the woman leaves the hospital, while she is in the home, that is where we are going to probably see some of the warning signs, where we really have to continue to support that mother and that family to help prevent another death. The other thing that is becoming increasingly apparent is, while we're doing a really good job of driving down the deaths in the hospitals, more women are dying outside of acute care settings in the community. So that community presence and support is extremely important. And I just want to give a little snapshot. If you have not seen the Missouri Pregnancy Associated Mortality Review, I would encourage everyone to read that. I saw that Ashley Otto from the Department of Health, who leads the PAMR effort, and Barb Gleason, who's a representative from the Boot Heel on the PAMR, are both on this call. Powerful, powerful statistics. Missouri, first of all, sort of tracks what we're seeing nationally. The majority of the deaths that they looked at occurred during that mid to late postpartum period. Interesting, motor vehicle crashes were the leading cause of death. So there are huge public health and community implications around that. Looking at substance use disorders as contributors. Again, there's cardiomyopathy, one of the leading causes of death in Missouri, as well as our mental health conditions. Importantly, I think it's also important to recognize that the rate of pregnancy-associated deaths were more than 4 times greater for Black women as compared to white women, and they were 5 times greater for women on Medicaid in Missouri. So certainly something to think about. And for those women who may experience a severe maternal event who don't die, or women who have had complications during pregnancy, those complications such as preeclampsia, blood pressure problems, cardiovascular disease, and so forth, really give us a window into the woman's health, both between pregnancies and for the rest of her life. So clearly, it's important to really look at maternal health and begin to develop mechanisms where women are supported throughout that perinatal continuum, at least during pregnancy and up to about 1 year postpartum, where we can transition to well woman care. And I would argue pre-pregnancy and preconception care is important in there as well. So I wanted to share some resources and some programs that are really looking at maternal health. Some of you may know about the Rural Maternity Obstetrics and Management Strategies grant that has come to the Boot Heel. This was a federal funding opportunity that came through HRSA, and the whole goal is to develop a sustainable network approach to coordinating care within a rural region. And the RMOMS participants are charged with looking at access for preconception, pregnancy, labor and delivery, and postpartum services. So really looking at preconception health, as well as prenatal care through delivery, And our charge is following women from birth through 6 months postpartum. So hopefully preconception, but really pregnancy up to 6 months post-birth. And importantly, and this is one of the first grants I've seen this in, developing sustainable financial models by partnering with the state Medicaid agency. So the correct answer is not go out and find another grant. The correct answer is figure out how to build a network and pay for it so that this doesn't go away when the grant goes away. And so what our moms is supposed to be looking at is improving that access and continuity of care with our OB units, coordinating that continuum of care, looking at how we use telehealth. And we've had with COVID some interesting opportunities to expand telehealth, as well as that financial sustainability. And the Boot Heel would not have gotten this grant if it were not for probably everybody on this call and everybody who touches women's lives in the Boot Heel. There's a tremendously strong history of collaboration in the Boot Heel, and I just want to call out a couple of things here. MBRC has been around for at least 20 years and is a collaborative and home to one of the oldest Healthy Start programs in the country. So we do it really well. Our Healthy Start program has been proven over and over again to make a difference. The behavioral health providers have come together and have a collaboration in Mississippi County, bringing behavioral health services to a county that didn't have that. MBRC and St. Francis had collaborated on a safe sleep project, sharing boxonettes and sharing resources so that women across the 6 counties and beyond could actually have access. And when we look at Boot Heel Babies and Families, that grew out of a collaboration with the health departments and MBRC. They formed the first backbone and really laid the foundation. And quite frankly, it was that foundation that brought all of these partners together that made it possible for us to bring all those partners and more into the room to develop the Our Moms grant. And now that program has really developed after they set the stage to becoming its own backbone with hub partners in all 6 counties that are bringing in even more community agencies for support for families. So I think we really need to celebrate the commitment in all 6 of these counties and what you've done. The project was awarded to St. Francis Medical Center as the lead, and there is a presence at 6 counties. There were upwards of 14 organizations that signed MOUs to be partners representing over 20 separate entities. That makes Missouri's, there were only 3 Our Moms grants in the country. There is one in Texas, there's one in New Mexico. Missouri's is the largest. We have the largest network, and the goal of this is not to create something new. While St. Francis is the lead, all of the resources and all of the effort has to go within those 6 counties. And the goal is to leverage what is already there, not to start yet a whole nother program. So some of the things that we've done already during the first year is really done comprehensive baseline mapping of where all of the resources are, where all of our partners are, so that we could identify gaps. There was a quality improvement Kaizen where everyone came together. We had over 50 people from the Boot Heel, from all of the different agencies come together and talk about what was needed in the Boot Heel, where were the gaps, and what we kept hearing over and over again was, we don't need another program. We need coordination of the services that are already here. And so those are the things that our partners are helping us to work on. Data collection. Well, apparently we're in the black, so everyone amazingly providing some wonderful contributions to our data collection efforts. And we're working to align with this existing program. So right now there are several work groups up. Network implementation, data and evaluation. So network and implementation is looking at what this network's going to look like. And all of the partners have a voice in that, as well as community members. education, looking at what's needed to help support maternal mortality efforts in the Boot Heel, figuring out what we want to do about telehealth, because there is some money in that grant to support expanding telehealth services. And within the next year, we will probably launch the sustainability work group, where we figure out how all of this gets paid for going forward. Now, these are the people in charge. I was really lucky enough to be involved as a consultant to the program, and I'll still be in the Boot Heel. But Barb Gleason, who many of you know from Building Blocks, is the project director for the Boot Heel Perinatal Network, and Morgan Nesselrod, who many of you know from a variety of positions in the Boot Heel, including the Baby Box Project, is our project coordinator. So if anything that I've said resonates and you want to be involved, we want as many people, as many agencies as possible involved, so that we can align all of these efforts. There are their emails. Give Barb and Morgan a call and let them know. Now, the other resource that is new, and this was also born out of the Boot Heel. About 3 years ago, there were some services added to the Boot Heel for case management services that no one in the Boot Heel knew about. And it was, and we knew that we already had some wonderful services down there with our health departments, with Building Blocks, with Healthy Start. And so Missouri Foundation for Health, who has been funding the infant mortality reduction initiative that led to Boot Heel Babies and Families, really started to think about how can we make sure that we know about all of the efforts going on throughout the state regarding maternal and infant health and women's health, so that we can have a more comprehensive approach statewide. And we gathered a lot of information from across the state, held a convening in Kansas City where people from the Boot Heel joined us, as well as all areas of the state, so Springfield area, St. Louis, etc., and really talked about what was needed. And what we heard was, again, we don't need another organization. What we really need is something to serve as a hub to connect all of us, so that we know what's going on throughout the state, so that we know if there are policy issues affecting moms and babies, we can all be aware and work together. If anybody is having a program, we can come together to support them instead of competing. And so we just launched the Uplift Connection within the last month. And the whole purpose of this is to serve as a hub, to convene thought leaders, to share these ideas, to make sure everyone is aware of those regional and local efforts, so that we can really build not only stronger regions in Missouri, but a stronger Missouri, and to begin to build that network of stakeholders. And I believe that you have information about this in your conference materials from MBRC. So the Uplift Connection is a website, and you can see the URL right there. You can go there to find resources about women's and maternal health. You can go there to find thought leaders, any news that's emerging, news about the 2020 convening that I'll talk about in a minute. And if you go there, you'll see that we are connected to places like MBRC, Boot Heel Babies and Families, and all of the important things that are going on in the Boot Heel. So you can just go there, click on that logo, and find out what folks are doing. The other important thing here is there is an interactive calendar. So when you're planning events like this, or any other events around maternal and infant health, you can go in, add that to the calendar, so that we don't end up with 10 different events about maternal health that are all competing with each other. So some really important resources, because what we were hoping to do is make sure that we're spending less time searching for this information, or having competing programs, or not knowing that there's a really good resource available, so that we can spend more of that time working for women in our communities. And as many of you know, the infant mortality convening that MFH holds every year is coming up September 29th. And so here is some information about that for you. Now, because you're going to have these available, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly as well. When again, one of the things to think about when we think about women's health, about maternal health, is really keeping women healthy across the lifespan. And so I wanted to share a national resource with you, because we know that when women are healthy, their communities thrive. We heard about how keeping women healthy and having healthy mothers helps us have healthier babies. So our goal is to keep women as healthy as possible. And again, if we look at that life course approach and we think about preconception health, health during the prenatal period, and health during that first year postpartum, while she transitions to well woman care during that 3 to 5 year time span between pregnancies, we can have opportunities to support women's health so that they go into pregnancies healthier. So one of the ways to do that is making sure that they get the care they need. And the Women's Preventive Services Initiative was designed to do that. So think about this woman, a 36-year-old who is obese with diabetes. Now, depending on where she goes for her care, in an ideal world, we think that every healthcare provider is going to make sure that we get all of the preventive services that we need. However, depending on the provider she is seeing and why she is seeing that provider, the whole range of preventive services may not necessarily be available, or there may be there may be different protocols in place, so not all preventive services are offered. There may be, for instance, she's obese and she has diabetes. Maybe the focus is on diabetes and not some of the other preventive services she needs. Or what if she's 18? Because we know that she still needs preventive services, and how does that impact what's happening in different provider settings? So the goal of the Women's Preventive Services Initiative was to make sure that all providers, no matter where a woman accesses care, would have the recommendations at hand so all women would receive the preventive health care that they need to keep them healthy throughout their lifespan. So this is another HRSA-funded initiative to develop and update recommendations for preventive health care for women across their lifespan that are not included in the already federally blessed recommendations. And one of the reasons that this is important is because once the recommendations are made about preventive services and the Health Resources and Services Administration accepts them, then they are available to all women without any kind of cost sharing, copay, and so forth. So it's really, really important. And we also look at those recommendations in terms of the evidence that's available and the research gaps. And one of the things I can tell you that we're finding is many of the recommendations around health, if you think about it, things like pap smears, mammograms, different types of screenings, we have very little information about the preventive health needs of different populations or people who don't have access to insurance. So those are part of the recommendations that are now going in and really highlighting that we have to be able to look at if all of this really works for everybody, or if we need to be thinking about what else we need to be thinking about in terms of preventive care. So one of the things that is available right now is something called a Well Woman chart. And the Well Woman chart lists out every recommendation for women's health by age. And it also lists out the preventive screenings and health care that should occur during prenatal care as well as postpartum care that are evidence-based and supported by the research. So some of the recommendations are specific to maternal care. For instance, the availability of breastfeeding services, lactation services, and supplies without cost sharing, screening for gestational diabetes, as well as a new recommendation that all women who have gestational diabetes be screened within 1 year postpartum for diabetes so that we can catch some of these chronic diseases earlier. There are also recommendations around contraception, around STI counseling, intimate partner exposures to intimate partner violence, and the newest recommendation is screening for anxiety. We know that the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force recommends screening for depression, including during prenatal and pregnancy and postpartum. This is a companion recommendation to screen for anxiety as well, because many women in that reproductive age group also report symptoms of anxiety. Now, again, and I'm going to go back to the chart for a minute. You can see on the chart, there are dark circles, and then there are sort of circles that are open circles. The dark circles mean that those are recommendations that should be available to everyone in that particular age group. The open circles mean that there is a special consideration. So for example, the diabetes screening for up to a year postpartum, that's for women who had gestational diabetes. Okay, why is this important? Because again, based on the Affordable Care Act, if you remember, under the Affordable Care Act, there are certain preventive services that are available to everyone without cost sharing, meaning that you don't have to have co-insurance, you don't have to pay a copay, you shouldn't have to pay for those preventive screenings. And I listed here which ones those are. Now, why this is exceptionally important right now in Missouri is because states that participate in Medicaid expansion are required to provide the same level of preventive services for the expansion population as the private plans. If you were not a Medicaid expansion state, women on Medicaid did not necessarily have access to all of these. So that is really important now that we are a Medicaid expansion state, because the recommended preventive services that all women deserve and should have access to will also be covered, and she will not have to provide a copay for that. So it's important because what we know is, in terms of preventive services, when people have sort of had uneven insurance coverage and access to care, this is why Dr. Caruso's comments about universal coverage were so important. It's not only about taking care of you when you're sick, it's about keeping us well and making sure we get the care we deserve. And when people don't have consistent access to insurance, they don't have consistent access to care. Once they get access to insurance and care, it takes about 5 years before they really start using those preventive services and following up. So we have a really good window here with our community programs and our home visiting programs that really follow women for, you know, quite a while after pregnancy, 1 to 2 years after pregnancy, because one of the things we can do is really help them understand how to utilize those preventive services so that they can stay as healthy as possible and recognize, be screened for chronic diseases and so forth, so that we can really help them stay healthy, not only for the next pregnancy, but for the rest of their lives. So certainly something that I think is going to be really important to consider. The other thing I would say is our community agencies provide such important services in terms of helping women with transportation, making sure that we address food insecurity, and all of those types of things that happen in communities, that happen outside of hospital and clinical offices. And just because a woman is 6 weeks postpartum or a year postpartum doesn't mean those needs necessarily go away. So those community supports and that embrace by the community of helping women access preventive care and access all of the type of support services that she needs during that postpartum time frame is going to be critical as well. And if you go to that Women's Preventive Services Initiative website that's listed on some of the slides, you'll find that there are a variety of supporting materials, including how to provide preventive services via telehealth. And as we think about COVID response, and we know that we may have some uneven response as we go into fall, where people may be concerned about going in for preventive services, or they may not be as readily available. But some of the preventive services can be available via telehealth, and you've already been doing some of them, particularly our home visitors, like our Healthy Start home visitors, and building blocks of the nurse home visitors as well, because some of the preventive health screenings include things like screenings for exposure to intimate partner violence, screening, counseling around sexually transmitted diseases, the mental health screenings that I mentioned before. All of those things are probably have heightened importance as people are less able to get out and may be more isolated or have increased anxiety over COVID and COVID response and so forth. So some really important things. There are also patient education pamphlets. All these are free. You can go online and download them. It might be something to think about putting into all of the materials that you provide for women during pregnancy and postpartum, so that they can begin to be aware of the types of care, again, that are available to them and the types of care they deserve. I can tell you, I took the Well Woman charts in for my own healthcare providers because I wanted them to know what all women, what the most current recommendations are. And oftentimes there's concern about payment. So for the providers in the audience, there is also a coding guide that will give guidance for all of the recommendations, including some of the nuances around Medicare and Medicaid. Importantly, there is a place for community voice here. All of the recommendations, before they become final, go out for public comment. They're on the website. So if it is something that sounds horribly unreasonable, or if there is something that you have input on, we really, really want to hear from you. If there are preventive services that you're feeling women need that they're not getting, that maybe aren't on these charts, we really want to hear about that too, because we would look at that very closely, initiate an evidence review, and it could become a recommendation that is, again, available to all women. So I really wanted to spend my time with you, because you've had such wonderful speakers, I really wanted to highlight two things. I wanted to highlight, number one, the uniqueness and the special commitment we have in the Boot Heel that has really driven bringing even more resources to the area because we are working together. And to say thank you for always working together and being at that table, because we can continue to really build on the great work that is there. And wanted to celebrate that and make sure that you knew about some of the resources that are available for women in the area. So again, you know where to find me. Thank you for including me in your day, and I'll turn it back over to you, Iris.
Thank you so much, Susan. Okay, up next we have Dr. Brian is going to share with us. And Nyrisha, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so whenever you're ready to start sharing your screen.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, perfect. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Dr.
Okay,
Jack, are you there?
thank you again, Susan. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Brian Jack, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you to all the attendees for attending such a wonderful meeting. And thank you to all the speakers who have been were really terrific and have fit together so nicely in all the points that they've made. It's been really great to listen this morning. So we're running late, so we'll move quickly through this presentation. But we're going to be talking about really about how to deliver preconception care in the clinical environment and in the public health environment. There's been a lot of discussion about risk factors for women prior to pregnancy. And we're going to talk about how we can, a system that we've developed to actually impact some of those health risks. Next slide. So we're talking about GABI system, which is the health information technology system that we've developed, about how it works, how it's been implemented in some Healthy Start sites, and how it's been implemented in the Boot Heel, and then what were some of the future activities.
Okay, yeah, Dr. Brian froze.
Oh.
There,
okay, I think he's back.
okay.
Was it me?
You froze there for a minute.
Go to the next slide, please.
Sure.
Okay, so the presenters will be Brian, Jack, that's me, and then Clayvan and Jules will take over, and then Narisha will take over towards the end. Next slide, please. So there's been a lot of discussion about this today, and this is something that I've been involved with for over 30 years, because these are the most despicable disparities of them all. And this shows kind of nicely low birth weight. This is white, Hispanic, and Black. And then preterm birth is in the middle, white, Hispanic, and Black, and then infant mortality, and then maternal mortality on the right in the upper corner, all showing 2 to 3 times greater incidence for African American Black women. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to spend a minute to talk about some of the theoretical models about the transgenerational approach and about systemic racism, and how systemic racism can, in the conceptual model, move towards poor obstetric outcomes. And there are 3 things that I want to highlight. One is the concept of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So ACEs, as you may know, are traumatic events occurring before the age of 18, things like psychological or physical abuse, violence against the mother, living with household members who are substance abusers, etc. And that these ACEs, and there are 18 of them, have long-term associations with adult disease, including ischemic heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, skeletal fractures, and liver disease. So this makes the connection that trauma as a youth is connected to your adult health. This is very important. And what's the mechanism for that? The second key concept that is emerging around a transgenerational approach is the concept of developmental origins of health and disease. And this is the Barker hypothesis, which is no longer our hypothesis, because there's ample evidence from a wide array of environmental, social, health-related risks up to the mother at the time of conception have profound and enduring effects, not only on the health of the mother, but on the health of the infant into adulthood. So in other words, the health risks associated with the mother and the father at the time of conception predicts not only the mother's health, the baby's health, but the baby's health as an adult. And this is not a hypothesis, there's ample evidence for this, which means that the concept of preconception care, we must move forward with preconception care to lower the health risk for mothers and fathers at the time of conception and before. The third concept is epigenetics. And it's very clear that prolonged activation of the stress response system from chronic stress, such as systemic racism over 400 years, can lead to toxic stress that has been shown to lead to biochemical changes at the level of the epigenome. And that epigenetic changes are not chromosomal, that's the proteins around the chromosomes, can be inherited, resulting in impact of future generations. So what this means is that a stress that a grandmother or her grandmother can result in adult disease of her grandchild or multiple generations down the road. And there's there's evolving evidence around the epigenomic impact on maternal and child health and the adult disease of the child moving forward. Next slide, please. So it gives credence to the concept of preconception care in that addressing some of these risks early in pregnancy, really at the time of conception, is important. So this is the time from the missed period to the mean entry into prenatal care, and the various systems of the body that are being developed in the embryo happen between 5 weeks and 12 weeks. So that if the mean entry into prenatal care is 12 weeks, you've missed the boat in terms of decreasing the risks that can be identified early in pregnancy, but even better, prior to pregnancy. Next slide, please. And these risk factors are very common. And this lists some of them. So like smoking, varies from state to state and place to place. 11%, alcohol, pre-existing medical conditions like diabetes, as we've talked about, hypertension and other things that have a direct impact on pregnancy and the outcomes of pregnancy. Rubella, HIV, inadequate prenatal care, cardiac disease, hypertension, et cetera, and they're listed there. And there's many, many more of them. So risk factors are common and they can be identified before pregnancy. And doesn't it make a lot of sense to identify these things before pregnancy rather than waiting until pregnancy to begin to address those risk factors? Next slide, please. So preconception care can do a whole lot. And preconception care is in effect the identification of health risks prior to pregnancy that, if you address them, improve the outcome of pregnancy. So this is not things that can, if it can be done equally well during pregnancy, it should be done then. But there are a whole variety of things that need to be done before pregnancy to see the impact on pregnancy. So Kay Johnson wrote this article, but this is from the select panel for the content of preconception care that met some years ago. Next slide, please. And that preconception interventions work in a whole variety of studies having to do with smoking, and this has been reviewed this morning already, in alcohol and diabetes and medications. For example, as childbirth gets older and chronic diseases get younger, there is an overlap of chronic medications around ACE inhibitors, around cholesterol medicines, which are transgenic medicines, and women should not be on them during pregnancy, but many, many, many are. Neural tube defects in terms of folic acid use, HIV, rubella family planning, and many other things. So there's plenty of evidence to show that preconception interventions are effective at decreasing both birth weight and in decreasing anomalies. Next slide, please. So I was lucky enough to be on the select panel on preconception care some years ago and was the co-chair of the clinical committee. And the first question that the group asked was, what is the content of preconception care? What is it that we're actually talking about? What is the evidence for preconception care? So this edition of the Gray Journal, the American Journal of OBGYN, was published, and there are 13 chapters or so. Each chapter lists the content of preconception care in those health domains, and the domains are listed there. So health promotion, immunization, infectious disease, et cetera. And overall, there was 104 different things that were reviewed showing the quality of the evidence and the impact on health outcomes if that health factor was identified before pregnancy and addressed before pregnancy, compared to identifying and addressing them during prenatal care. So 104 different things for which we think there is evidence that we need to be doing something about it before pregnancy to impact the outcomes. Next slide, please. So the feedback that we got was that this doesn't really fit very well into the concept of the 15-minute office visit. And how can clinicians screen for 104 different things and work over time to change behaviors, et cetera, for many of these things in the context of care? And that is why it is that the preconception care has not really got the traction within healthcare that it really, really deserves. And as the data accumulates, it's becoming less and less acceptable that we're really not providing preconception services to women around the country. So the select panel, we said the second thing was, first was, what's the content? The second thing is, can we build tools that can help clinicians and Healthy Start workers and others to provide preconception care? So we've been working now for 8 or 9 years to develop the GABI system. So GABI is shown here. It's a computer-based system now moving towards cell phones that screens for those 100 risks that we talked about, has tailored content based upon the user's unique responses, uses behavioral change techniques such as shared decision-making, motivational interviewing, and other things, tailored to the trans-theoretical model. So if they're pre-contemplative, then they get motivational interviewing, et cetera. We'll talk about that in a second. And then provides 12 months of evidence-based content to mitigate those health risks, the preconception health risks. Next slide, please. So maybe we can skip this, Marisha, because of the time.
Okay.
We can show you a clip. We'll put a clip in the slides that you can watch on your own time, maybe. Let's go to the next slide. So we did a whole variety of qualitative research with young African-American women to identify what would be, how should the character act? What's her name and her appearance and the content of the risk assessment, the content of the dialogue that happens to mitigate those risks. And then all the different kind of components of the system that were put in. So there's a lot of feedback from the user groups about how GABI was developed. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, GABI uses techniques like motivational interviewing to reach out to people who are pre-contemplative, which means that they, in the trans-theoretical model, there's pre-contemplation, contemplation, planning, action, maintenance. So behavior change is a series of things, not an event that goes from yes or no. So people who are pre-contemplative really don't want to move forward. So GABI actually takes people who are not, who are pre-contemplative, saying to take folic acid, and helps them to move towards contemplation. I mean, they're thinking about it, moving towards planning, like, how do I do it? And that's how the system works. And then shared decision-making is for people who have decided to do it, but want to know how exactly it is done. And then other techniques like problem solving, goal setting, homework, and other things that are based on the science of health behavior change that are built into the system. Next slide. So we did a 5-year study funded by the National Institute of Minority Health Disparities, a 5-year randomized controlled trial that, you're lucky to hear, is published this month. So you're really the first national audience to be hearing the results of this trial. It's in this edition of The Lancet Digital Health, and answers the question, does GABI improve preconception health of African-American women? So you can go online, when you get the slides, you can click on that and you can get the, you can download the article if you're interested. Next slide. So we did this randomized controlled trial of 528 women randomized to use GABI or to get a list of their preconception risks and say, go to the doctor and talk about these things. And then the outcome data was, did they move forward in terms of their feelings about changing these risks? And did they actually achieve action or maintenance in terms of each of those risks? Next slide, please. So we recruited African-American and Black women from 35 different states, as is shown here. Next slide, please. And that's the trans-theoretical model. So pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And we measured for each of the 104 risks, we identified the 7 or 8 things that apply to an individual woman, because they don't want to hear about the 104. They want to hear about the 7 things that are relevant to them. And then ask them, how willing are you to change this? Where are you on this scale of stage of change for each of those risks? And then measured 6 months, and then measured again at 12 months to see if there was any difference. Next slide, please. And what we showed is, we'll just look at the first column, the first row, which says risks at action or maintenance at 6 months. So you see in the intervention group, that's the group that got GABI, compared to the control group, the group that said, here's your list of risks, go talk to your doctor. What that shows is that half the risks that were identified for women who use GABI reached the action or maintenance stage, meaning they were resolved, they're gone. And 42% did in the control group, which is a highly statistically significant difference. And that extended across all the various domains. Next slide, please. Just a little bit. So what this shows is if you look at, say, reproductive health, which is 1, 2, 3, the fourth one down. Yep. The red, thank you, Marisha. The red line is the control group. So the open circle is where they started at baseline. The red dot is where they ended at, I think, 12 months. And the blue is the intervention group, where they started and where they ended. So if you look down that chart, you can see that in each of the domains of preconception care, the blue line goes further to the right than the red line, meaning that women made more progress who used Gabi than those that were told to go to your clinician and talk about these risks. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So we're gonna toss off to Narisha or Clay?
Narisha, yep.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jack. So I briefly want to highlight some of the qualitative feedback that we've received over after the randomized control trial that Dr. Jack just talked about. So we conducted focus groups and individual interviews and qualitative feedback throughout the 10-year development period, but I'm really just going to highlight 2 quotes that are exemplary of some of the feedback that we received about the Gabi system. So first, one woman says, I think that's the great thing about having something like Gabi is that she's relatable because she looks similar to you. This is something that hopefully will be going out to more diverse communities because I feel like a lot of times health is also tied to affluence. So this person feels more comfortable with talking to Gabi, especially because she does look like her. And that's some of the things that our focus groups provided feedback on in terms of what does Gabi look like? What is she going to wear? What is her makeup? What is her skin tone? What is her hair going to look like? And that really informed our development process and the personality that Gabi has. The second quote, to be honest with you, I really was never educated on low birth weight among African Americans. I honestly didn't know that was the truth or fact. I think a part of it has to do with my environment because of who I socialize with. So sometimes I tend to forget a couple things until I go outside in the real world and I'm like, oh my God, this is real. I think this is especially powerful because this was from a few years ago. And I think as people in the MCH world and as we know so much about low birth weight, a lot of people are not talking about this. As professionals, we frequently talk about it, but I think a lot of other folks who are in this community are not talking about it. And I think recently with Serena Williams and Beyonce's birthing stories that came out in the media, this is a topic that's getting more and more traction in education and attention. But I think for a long time, this was not something that was talked about frequently, and it's good to remember that. So now I'm going to transition into talking about the implementation that we're doing right now. So Dr. Jack talked about the efficacy of the Gabi system through the randomized control trial and our other projects. So now we really want to focus on the effectiveness of the Gabi system. So what does it look like when we take Gabi out of the research setting, out of research assistants calling women to use the Gabi system, and out of incentivization to how do we implement the Gabi system at community-based sites? And as you know, implementation is a very new and emerging field. So I do think that when we first wrote this proposal, there was a huge gap in information pertaining to the implementation of programs, especially health IT tools. So this was something that we definitely wanted to contribute to. So now more than ever, especially with COVID, we see the need to expand our telehealth capacity and contribute to that need and address that need. And we truly believe that Gabi is a prototype or is a way to do that. So with guidance from experts in this field, we developed our 7-step implementation methodology process, which I'll highlight here briefly. So first we do an introductory call. So we're working with community-based sites like Healthy Start sites and community health centers, and one of which is Missouri Boot Heel Regional Consortium, who is our partner in this implementation. So first we start off with an introductory call. That's really the first point of contact with sites. And then we do process mapping to really understand what does the site clinical flow look like, and then where can Gabi be integrated. We do stakeholder perspectives, so a series of interviews to really talk with different staff members, get their perspectives, and understand what are the facilitators and barriers to implementation, and is the site ready. And then we'll do a site visit where research staff travel to the site to do a comprehensive training and then observe site workflow. And then following a launch webinar that's directly a couple weeks before implementation to really hone in on the mechanics of the Gabby system and make sure frontline staff are equipped with everything that they need to actually implement. So with the nature of frontline staff and obviously the high burden that they have with their caseload and everything that they have to do, we realized that Gabby is an ideal way to provide care to women and provide information 24/7 that women can access online as a way to augment what frontline staff are already doing. And then we do implementation for 6 months, and where the site recruits 25 to 50 women, and we provide technical assistance. And then we have another series of interviews where we get feedback from site staff and end users to understand their perceptions of the Gabby system and their feedback. So I know that was a really quick overview, but essentially through the data collected at these various steps, we were able to gather insight on the following 3 implementation outcomes of interest. So Gabby's acceptability at the site, Gabby's appropriateness at the site, and whether or not Gabby was indeed feasible at the site. So these outcomes are grounded in Proctor et al.'s implementation taxonomy and has helped generate a lot of discussion about the modifications and adaptations need to be made both to Gabby and also our implementation efforts. One thing that we like to stress is that sites know their staff members and their clients the best. So this framework is a suggestion, and these activities are not always done in the same way. It just depends on the site and their culture and what's going on. So obviously the site knows what's going to work best for their clients and their staff members. So I want to highlight a couple of the lessons that we learned so far with our partnership with MBRC. And these are some of the emerging themes that we found through the stakeholder interviews that we've done in our qualitative work. And we're looking to implement by the end of this year with MBRC. So some of the things that really helped facilitate the implementation efforts was the role of the site leadership. So definitely the leadership from Ms. Dean and the rest of the staff members at MBRC really helped champion the efforts of implementation. We started talking to MBRC more than a year and a half ago, and it's really Ms. Dean's commitment to bringing the Gabby system to her site that really helped reinvigorate these efforts. There's also a strong organizational culture. We really feel that all the site staff are extremely committed to their clients, and we see that in their efforts to try to bring Gabby and try to implement Gabby. And that in this COVID era, Gabby would support the current telehealth efforts as everyone is transitioning to working from home and providing activities and care from home. Gabby neatly aligns with that telehealth framework. But something that we also realized, given that we are from Boston, from an urban area, and grew up in either urban or suburban environments, is the barriers and challenges unanticipated of working with a very rural site. So that was very much a humbling experience for us, because through our RCT that we previously talked about, and with the other sites that we're working with, we have not yet worked with a rural site. So it's definitely very eye-opening for us to see some of the transportation issues, a lot of the computer and internet access issues that some of the staff members talked about that their clients experience. There's also some unanticipated COVID-related barriers, as well as competing staff and client priorities like changes in staff structure or infrastructure, and the bandwidth for staff and clients. So with everything going on, you know, is it reasonable to expect women to check in with Gabby or make that a priority? So now I'm going to hand it off to Clay, who's going to talk a little bit about our work with men and our international efforts with health IT.
Thank you, Narisha. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, great. So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Clayvon Jules, and I work as the project manager for Dr. Jack's preconception care portfolio. I've been involved with the team now a little over 6 years and manage the recruitment and enrollment of young Black and African American women nationwide for the randomized control trial that Dr. Jack touched on. And now I oversee the implementation efforts that's currently taking place in our community-based sites. So again, thank you, Ms. Dean and MBRC for inviting us to join your conference this morning. I think this has been such a great conference thus far, and from my perspective, very successful, intentional, timely, and powerful. So what I'm going to do really quickly is just switch gears for a few minutes to touch on some of the projects we have created concurrently with Gabby and are still working to test out into the real world. So at the start of the conference, Ms. Deborah Fraser touched on fatherhood, and a couple of other speakers have touched on the importance of fatherhood. And over the last 10 years, I think there's really been a push to have this conversation around where do men fit into the MCH dialogue. In 2015, I believe Dr. Jack and Ken Harris, who many of you know and has been involved with Healthy Start for quite some time, published a viewpoint in JAMA around the health of young African American and Black men. And through that viewpoint, I think they really made the case about, you know, there's a threat to Black men's health in our society, and that's a threat to Black men's fatherhood overall. And that we need to start taking seriously the disparities that are the results of systemic and institutionalized racism and have conversations around this. So we were awarded in 2015 as well some funds from Kellogg to create a men's health system for African American and Black men. And our selling point to the funders during that time was honing in on the domino effect of healthy moms and dads lead to healthy babies, and healthy babies leads in turn to healthy communities. So unlike Gabby, where we really focused on the medical and physical aspects of preparing the body for pregnancy, I think in the GAVE system, we touched on some of the major chronic conditions, yes, but I think we really spent most of our time talking about the social determinants of health that are unique to Black and African American men. So using what we called our PAG, which was a longitudinal focus group over the span of 3 years, we addressed a lot of these issues, including the stigma around men's mental health, healthy communication and relationships, the school to prison pipeline, the role of incarceration and employment, violence, just discussions that are not had nearly enough in this community. So in the next slide is a quick clip of Gabe, but I think for the sake of time, I am going to skip it for today and talk about the next system that we developed globally for Lesotho women. So in addition to Gabe, who I just talked about, which is our African-American counterpart of Gabby, we also have developed our first mobile conversational agent called Ntabi. And Ntabi means happiness in Lesotho, which is a little landlocked kingdom that exists in South Africa. So you actually have to go to South Africa to get to Lesotho. So Lesotho is what we consider a low and middle income country and has some of the highest rates of HIV, TB, and maternal mortality worldwide. And through funds from the Fogarty Center, International Center, we partnered with our colleagues in Lesotho to create a new system called Ntabi to be used on Android cell phones. So now we're in the process of doing focus groups and key informant interviews there to use a lot of the information that we've learned from both Gabby, but to really fit the regional needs that are specific to Lesotho. And so over the next few months, we do plan on implementing Ntabi into 10 district hospitals in Lesotho. And our work there closely aligns with the Global Fund's 90-90-90 initiative around HIV testing. So a little different, it really speaks to women's health more so than preconception care, but nonetheless, very, very important health issues. As Narisha touched on earlier, as with Gabby, I think mHealth interventions are crucial, especially in the age of COVID, but in communities like Lesotho that really do not have the capacity to service all the individuals that are there with health information and counseling. And I think, next slide, please, Narisha. And I think one of the things that we learned early on is that Lesotho, part of the Lesotho culture is soap operas. And so particularly among this age group who tends to be very hip, they listen to soap operas on television, radio, podcasts. And so now we're collaborating with a local storyteller. Her name is Daneo, and she's pictured on the slide here, who's created 60 short serial segments to be integrated into the system as a way to engage users. So really learning how to culturally adapt what we've already created and tested for efficacy into the local context of a different community that's also very rural but has unique challenges. So now I'm just going to hand it back to Dr. Jack to close off this presentation with some final thoughts.
Oh, Dr. Jack, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Clay, and thank you, Narisha. So our final thoughts is that we're very proud of Gabby. You know, Gabby is, we think, the most advanced, comprehensive, and tested patient-facing health information technology system, and it's widely scalable. You know, it's been a lot of years and a lot of money to develop it, but now it's available basically for free to be used. And I just want to make the point that, you know, we're not a company, you know, pitching something. We do research and development, and our academics, and you know, and we don't want Gabby to sit on the shelf and get dusty. And there's a lot of randomized controlled trials with positive results that don't really work very well in the real world, because the work isn't done to make it work in the real world. So we would like to see it work, and we like to see it work and used in Healthy Start and other similar kinds of sites. The idea of tailoring the dialogue to their stage of change and engagement with the stories and things like that are real game changers in terms of getting people to use it. And the emphasis now is not so much on efficacy, that is, does it work, but on implementation as in effectiveness, does it work in the real world? And that we think that Gabby can be used as an adjunct to clinical care, in other words, an assistant to Healthy Start workers or to clinicians in the office, or as a population health tool used independently, where women can print out what we call the after hospital and the My Health to-do list, which can be brought into the clinician to be discussed. And implementation of Gabby and Gabe in Healthy Start sites is something that would be very possible. We have developed this the Gabby implementation toolkit, which is ready to go. So if there were places that were interested in trialing it, if there were a group of Healthy Start sites interested, that we could you know, make it available to the group. Next slide, please. And then the last slide, I just want to show you that if we do all the things that were talked about in all the lectures today, which are also wonderful, and if we that we could create the preconception baby of the future. And this is a picture, you can probably see it, but there's a baby on an ultrasound, and you can see the head and see the sucking its thumb, its backbone, and its legs. And if we do really terrific preconception care, this is what happens to this baby. So that's going to be one really awesome baby if we could do preconception care. So thank you all very, very much for your attention to our lecture and for the great morning today. Thank you.
Turn me down.
Okay, you're unmuted. I can hear you. I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Ready?
Yep.
Okay. Hello, everyone. We're at the end of our workshop, and we've had a great morning with a lot of great speakers with wonderful expertise and experience. And so I'm going to bring Rhonda on. I know we went over a little, but we're going to bring Rhonda on to finalize some of our housekeeping rules. I want to thank everyone for participating, and please stay safe. Thank you.
Oh.
Okay, you're speaker now. Thank you guys so much. Thank you again to our presenters. That was phenomenal. I really learned a lot and really enjoyed listening to everybody. I'm going to go over a few things with you guys as soon as I get it pulled up here. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so like I said at the beginning, we are going to get everybody a copy of the presentation, and then we can send PowerPoints with that. And I'll also send another copy of the program for anybody that didn't see it. It does have like bios on all the speakers, and it also has like the links to Dr. Jack's articles in there. And we will also be sending evaluations out to everybody by 5 p.m. today. You guys will have until September 27th to complete the evaluation. And then on the 28th by 5 p.m. we'll notify the winner. We're going to do a randomized winner, and then we will get in contact with you via email to see how to proceed with the gift card. Everybody will also be sent a certificate of completion by September 28th. Thank you guys again so much. I'm going to check the chat box. It looks like I might have a couple comments. If you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Bye. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Great
Hey,
conference.
Cynthia.
All right, round two. We're done. I just think this.
Usually they do a roll call.